On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store. Since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman getting into a van with a baby. They approached and explained the situation. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store. Since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman. They decided to take it for analysis just in case. Rosgan got in touch with John Flowers to inform him that the police had visited his store. John was quite surprised that they hadn't found the girl yet, but readily answered all the questions. He explained that the bleach smell in the storeroom was because his dog used it as a toilet, and he had to clean up after it frequently. It was possible that's how a tiny drop of blood ended up there. As for the surveillance camera footage and the receipts for the book purchases, he would need to come to the store to look for them and hand them over to the police. Rosgan asked about the books Ginger bought, and this is where the surprise came in. One book was about creating a new identity, and the other was about contract killers. But why did Ginger buy these? Did she genuinely intend to disappear? Or did someone force her to buy these books and then kill her in one of the ways described in the second book? The tiny spot on the wall, possibly blued, turned out to be too small for analysis. Nevertheless, it wasn't very important since everyone already knew Ginger had been in the store and left. What was much more critical was figuring out where she went afterward. Indeed, there were several possible leads, especially considering Ginger's striking beauty and her public performances. Many people, including those with bad intentions, could have noticed her. Moreover, her father worked as a dealer in one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. When it comes to money, things can get messy. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding the girl alive was dwindling. The answer regarding Mark's car came, and guess what? They found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing at all. At this point, Rosgan thought of John Flowers. He considered the possibility of checking the surveillance camera footage to see if someone had approached Ginger at the store's exit. However, he was too late. Exclaiming, "Where have you been all this time, guys?" John explained that he had reviewed the footage, saw Ginger entering the store, choosing the books, paying in cash, and leaving. Since no one had come for the video, it had been overwritten with new footage from the surveillance camera. John also couldn't find the receipt for the books, although he was certain that it should be somewhere. After this, John seemed unwilling to cooperate further with the detective, partly because his business had suffered due to police, media, and curious onlookers who crowded his shop after Ginger's disappearance. Selling lockpicks and fake police badges in a store that was already filled with law enforcement paraphernalia was understandable, but it put immense pressure on his small business. Rosgan understood this, and there was nothing to push John into talking with them. The case was put on the back burner, and the police had no new leads. In fact, the truth was there, but the detectives working on Ginger's case wouldn't discover it until several more months passed. On May 5th, in the Mojave Desert, nearly 400 miles from Vegas, a group of hunters stumbled upon a shallow grave. The medical examiner determined that the body in the grave belonged to a young, dark-haired girl aged 15 to 18. She had no identification on her, but the killer hadn't taken her quite distinctive jewelry, a pink ring with 3 colored stones and another ring shaped like wire loops, intertwined to form the letter M or W. Could the M signify Mark? Or perhaps it was a family heirloom, because Ginger's mother's maiden name was Watersworth. Hoping for public assistance, the local police published photos of the jewelry, but it would be a very long time before they would learn the truth. In the meantime, to crack the case, the detectives needed a lead or a body. Suddenly, on August 16, 1997, Jeff Rosgan received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as a federal agent from Arizona and claimed to have a lead on the Ginger case. Rosgan was intrigued. The agent explained that John Flowers had been accused of selling illegal eavesdropping devices. But what did this have to do with Ginger? The agent continued. John had gone on the run because he didn't want to be arrested, but his wife, Cheryl Cizone, had been brought in for questioning. They were interested in her husband's whereabouts, but suddenly she started talking about Ginger Rios, who had disappeared in Vegas several months ago. The agent left the room to make a call to Rosgan. It was only now that Rosgan realized he had never formally questioned the owner of the spy shop, the last place Ginger was seen. And yet, Ginger's husband had mentioned that there was a man and a woman behind the counter. Rosgan asked the agents not to let Cheryl out of their sight and hurried to Arizona. Rosgan couldn't have anticipated what Cheryl's interrogation would reveal. When Ginger entered the shop to browse for books, John Flowers turned to Cheryl and asked her to go buy film. This wasn't unusual, as she often ran errands when they worked together at the store. Cheryl returned after about 10 minutes, and that's when Mark walked in. John told Mark that his wife had just left and couldn't have gone far. Mark thanked them and left. Cheryl's husband seemed like a different person. He had a terrified look on his face. She asked him what was going on, and the man replied, "I did something terrible. Whatever you do, don't go into the storage room." Cheryl had no idea what he meant, and it never occurred to her that her husband had harmed someone. However, His behavior unsettled her, and a little while later, she decided to check the storage room. Inside, she found the lifeless body of a young girl with a pool of blood surrounding her head. The carpet was also soaked in blood. The girl had been brutally beaten. It was the same girl who had entered the shop before John had sent Cheryl to get film. Cheryl felt disgusted, but her disgust quickly turned into fear when she realized John was right behind her. She hadn't even turned around when he grabbed her by the neck and ordered her never to speak about what had happened there, or something bad would happen to her as well as their child. Cheryl obeyed his command, but now that John was on the run, she decided to tell the truth. The detective wanted to know how John explained the situation to Cheryl. John told her that Ginger had a note from 2 of his former employees who were demanding money. Supposedly, the contents of the note and Ginger's insolence had infuriated John, and he had hit her so hard in the face that she fell back, hit her head, and died. However, Cheryl was convinced that this was a lie, and she had never seen the note. She did know for sure that John had taken garbage bags and spent several hours in the storage room, wrapping the girl's body in plastic bags and pouring bleach around her. He had told the employee that the dog had used the room as a restroom. Then, he put the body in his van and told Cheryl they needed to leave for Arizona immediately. That's when Ginger's father and husband approached them and pleaded for them to show the surveillance camera footage. John and Cheryl looked them in the eyes and lied, even though Ginger was lying just inches away from them. But that's not all. Cheryl also knew where her husband had buried the body. You see, they had gone to the Mojave Desert several times, John and Cheryl together. One time, John left Cheryl in the middle of nowhere and drove off with their baby and the girl's body. It's clear that he buried her, returned for Cheryl, and drove home. But this wasn't enough for him. They went to that location several more times so John could hide the shallow grave under a layer of concrete. It was only the last time that John came running back panicked and screaming, "They found her! They found her!" So Cheryl was quite certain that the police had already discovered Ginger's body. In any case, she agreed to show the detectives the location in exchange for no charges being filed against her. They accepted her offer because they didn't believe Cheryl had been involved in the murder. She led them to the spot. When they arrived in the desert, the local officers started connecting the dots between the body found by hunters in May and Cheryl's revelation. Cheryl asked them to stop the car and led them to the place her husband had visited. The police expected to find an empty grave, but instead, they reached a concrete slab that appeared untouched. There, they discovered the body wrapped in plastic bags. Thanks to a tattoo on the lower back, they had a preliminary identification as Ginger, but they decided to wait for DNA analysis before informing her family. This raised several unanswered questions. Were there 2 victims? Did John kill both? If so, why and who was the second girl? Now they could secure a search warrant for the Vegas store where they found traces of Ginger's blood. The DNA analysis later confirmed that the body in the desert also belonged to her. Mark, who had clung to the hope that his wife had simply left and started a new life, was devastated. He blamed himself, thinking he should have gone to the store with her. But how could he have imagined that a complete stranger, the owner of a popular and frequently visited store, would attack his wife, someone who was a mother and his loving spouse? John's attempt to hide didn't last long, and he was arrested at a hotel in Los Angeles. The extradition process began, during which the detectives discovered that there was no John Flowers, the owner of the spy store's chain. Instead, there was a 26-year-old Craig Jacobson wanted for crimes committed in Florida. From the age of 10, the boy had struggled with mental health issues, suffering from paranoia, borderline personality disorder, and likely antisocial personality disorder. He spent a year in a mental health clinic and then served 30 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. However, in 1995, he disappeared. In his place, John emerged. In addition to this revelation, the police found another potential victim of John or Craig. 2 months prior, a teenage girl had entered the Vegas store, but before she could even browse the merchandise, the owner approached her, slung her over his shoulder, and carried her into the storeroom without uttering a word. Her luck was incredible because another customer entered the store and scared John Flowers away, so he released her. This young woman didn't report the incident to the police out of fear, and her word against the word of a respected businessman could have been problematic. This, of course, was before the truth about John came to light. In the following months, psychiatrists examined him multiple times and deemed him unfit to stand trial. The prosecutor was convinced that Craig was faking it, but feared that the crime might go unpunished. He explained to Ginger's family that the best option would be to offer him a plea deal. Craig agreed to plead guilty to the murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison before he could be eligible for parole. As for the other girl, Craig mentioned her name as Mary Stoddard. She was the 18-year-old daughter of a chiropractor who had come to Vegas when he kidnapped and killed her. Ginger Rios' relatives hoped that he would be charged with Mary's murder, which could at least result in a life sentence or possibly even the death penalty. But here's the catch. Mary Stoddard, the daughter of a chiropractor as described by Craig, was alive and well. The body of the unidentified girl had already been reburied, but they had previously created a 3D model of what she might have looked like and obtained a DNA sample. This was all the police had, because as it unexpectedly turned out, the documents with information about her place of burial were lost, and no one knew in which grave she was located. In simpler terms, they had lost the body. Nevertheless, the police didn't give up on trying to identify who she was. In their list of missing persons, there were 300 people. Finally, on June 30th, 2010, after 13 years, they managed to identify the girl. More precisely, she turned out to be a teenage girl, as it was 15-year-old Christina Mary Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona. The girl lived in a group home, but constantly ran away from it because she was treated poorly there. She disappeared on May 3, 1997, while carrying a load of laundry to a self-service laundromat. Her path led her past the spy shop in Phoenix. Despite her difficult childhood, Christina had many people who loved her and were looking for her, including her friend Valerie, who never stopped searching for her. Valerie created various social media profiles in an attempt to draw attention to Christina's disappearance. Valerie would say, "No matter how long it takes, I will never stop thinking about her, and I won't give up. For me, she's not just a case number. I loved her. That's true love, never giving up on finding someone." Valerie couldn't have known that Christina was found just a week after her disappearance, in the desert, on her 16th birthday. As for the mystery of the girl's ring, the letter M on it signifies Martinez. Interestingly, the sister of the real Mary Stoddard mentioned that Craig had dated Mary when they were both younger. The guy was already behaving strangely back then, and if this is true, he could have become so fixated on Mary that after parting ways with her, he always sought women who resembled her to vent his anger. Considering that Mary is alive, but Craig called Christina Mary, it's possible that this was a fantasy he played out in his head while committing the crime, as many killers, especially serial killers, do. Most likely, Craig didn't plan his crimes but succumbed to impulsive acts, as was the case with the teenage girl from Vegas who survived because another customer scared the killer away. It's also possible that he targeted victims. As we know, Ginger had been to the store before her disappearance. Craig never revealed the reasons for his behavior, but investigators believe the murders aimed at violence against women because Ginger's underwear was found around her ankles. In any case, now, thanks to being charged with a second murder, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. It's remarkable that Craig was able to deceive so many people so easily. Mark and George, who were searching for Ginger, his own wife Cheryl, who had no inkling of his hidden nature, and even experienced Vegas police officers who had seen much in their careers. He truly appeared like an ordinary family man. And it makes you wonder where one can feel safe, if not with a store owner standing behind the counter with his wife and baby. Perhaps they first saw each other at the team gathering participating in cross-country running competitions in early autumn of 1995. Two high school girls from neighboring small towns competing in the 3-kilometer race. No one saw them exchange even 2 words or shake hands, as is customary among competition participants. And why should they? The girls hardly knew each other's names. Their characters and interests were so polarized. One of them, a cheerful, smiling blonde with translucent skin, captivated her classmates. The other, more graceful and petite, mesmerized with an entirely different beauty. Dark hair framed her face like a halo. Her eyes revealed a lively, inquisitive mind and determination. Catching her penetrating gaze made it impossible to look away. The girls had no reason to believe they had anything in common besides running. How could they know that their fates would be forever linked by their acquaintance with a young man, tall, sun-kissed, an aspiring cadet at a military academy? The two runners stood at the starting line, awaiting the shot from the starting pistol. It wouldn't be long before they would meet again. On the early morning of December 4th, 1995, a farmer traveling along a country road noticed the body of a teenage girl on the ground behind a barbed wire fence. Initially, it seemed to him that the poor girl had fallen victim to a car accident. Her face was almost unrecognizable. As later became known, she had been struck with something heavy, followed by 2 gunshots to the head. She was wearing shorts and a t-shirt with an inscription that quickly led the police to her school and eventually helped identify the girl. Adrienne Jones, a 16-year-old student from the small town of Mansfield, southeast of Fort Worth. The former farming settlement with a rodeo arena and charming antique shops along the main street, Mansfield was one of the last places near Dallas and Fort Worth where the serene atmosphere of a small town still lingered. In 1984, seeking a quiet and peaceful place to raise their children, Bill Jones and his wife Linda, along with their 3 kids, Adrienne and her younger brothers, moved to Mansfield. Bill was captivated by the modest neighborhood where houses stood neatly in rows, their green, lovely yards touching each other, while the voices of playing children echoed through the streets. Bill and Linda raised their children with strictness, especially Adrienne. However, she was never a rebel. She excelled academically and dedicated a lot of time to sports. After a knee injury during a football game, she joined the girls' cross-country team to get back in shape and proved herself to be such an excellent runner that she helped the team qualify for participation in regional competitions in Lubbock. The restaurant manager where she worked part-time was thrilled with the cheerful and lively employee, as were the customers, especially the boys. There was no shortage of guys interested in dating Adrienne, and it was precisely her sociable nature that made the investigation into her murder so challenging. Typically, when adults are killed, there are no more than 24 people who knew them closely. But a high school girl interacts with hundreds of other kids every day. Detectives quickly realized that Adrienne knew her killer or killers. There were no signs of struggle at the crime scene. Her hands or legs weren't tied. No one had broken into her home to abduct her. Subsequent autopsy revealed that violence wasn't the motive behind the crime. Her death seemed more like an execution, a result of someone's incredible rage, because it takes an extremely cold-blooded person to shoot a familiar girl in the face from half a meter away. Police compiled a list of individuals who might have had a grudge against Adrienne when Bill and Linda Jones reluctantly informed detectives that on the evening of their daughter's death, they allowed her to talk on the phone after the usual 10 p.m. curfew. Her boyfriend, Tracy Smith, was on a trip with his parents and managed to call her quite late. Bill allowed his daughter a few minutes to talk to Tracy. Linda overheard during the conversation that her daughter told Tracy to hold on because someone else was calling. Adrienne switched to call waiting and spoke with someone for a minute before ending the call with Tracy. When Linda asked her daughter who had called, she replied, "Oh, it's David from the cross-country team." He seemed upset about something. After talking with Tracy, Adrienne went to her room but didn't go to bed. Instead, she started ironing her school clothes. Linda recalls that her daughter seemed agitated. She instructed her to turn off the lights and go to sleep. The night passed quietly, except for the fact that shortly after midnight, Adrienne's younger brother heard the sound of a running engine near the house. When he looked out the window, he saw a pickup truck driving away from the house. The next morning, Adrienne wasn't in her room, but her parents thought she might have gone for a run. However, upon finding her sneakers, they grew concerned. Linda called her daughter's coach to inquire if there was a guy named David in the team. "Well, there's David Graham," the coach replied. Linda informed the coach that her daughter was missing and that David might have called her in the evening. The coach was puzzled. She didn't even know that David and Adrienne were friends. When asked if he had called the girl in the evening, David expressed confusion, stating that he had no reason to do so. Investigators also spoke with David, but quickly ascertained that he had no connection to Adrienne's death. so they didn't even propose a polygraph test to him. Firstly, Adrienne's phone book didn't have David's name. Secondly, none of her friends mentioned him. Adrienne's close friends claimed that she shared her most intimate secrets with them, yet none mentioned anything about David. The prime suspect in Adrienne's case became a teenage girl from Mansfield, Tara, who lived in a trailer and had earned a bad reputation in town. A year earlier, she suspected her boyfriend of cheating on her with one of Adrienne's friends. According to police reports, the girl attacked her rival with a baseball bat and wounded her boyfriend with a gun. During the trial, Adrienne testified in favor of her friend, for which the accused vowed revenge against her. Some school students were convinced that this girl was responsible for the murder because she had already demonstrated her capacity for violent attacks with weapons. However, she had a solid alibi and passed a lie detector test. In turn, Bill and Linda suspected their daughter's boyfriend, Tracy Smith, because he didn't attempt to contact the family after Adrienne's murder. The girl's parents didn't know Tracy well. He was a tall football player attending school in the neighboring town of Venus. Apparently, he and Adrienne had met 2 months prior at a diner where she worked. Tracy also successfully passed a polygraph test. However, he provided the police with a new lead. He said that Adrienne told him that during their conversation that evening, it wasn't David who called her at home, but Brian. She mentioned that Brian seemed upset and wanted to meet her that night to talk. Investigators discovered that Brian McMillan worked nearby the restaurant where the girl worked part-time. He had a strong liking for her and would often visit to see her. However, he became so intrusive that when the girl saw him at the restaurant, she would hide behind the counter. Things took a darker turn when investigators found out that the 17-year-old boy was taking 4 types of medications to manage symptoms of depression. During police questioning, he initially claimed not to know Adrienne, then admitted knowing her, but couldn't recall if he spoke with her that night because he had been drinking heavily for the past 6 months. He mentioned feeling sad because all his friends had girlfriends and he felt like an outcast. The police built a compelling case. A young man unable to attract the attention of a beautiful girl finds a way to meet her at night, but loses control. Brian didn't deny the possibility of visiting Adrienne or taking her somewhere. He simply couldn't remember. On December 15, 1995, the police searched his house, seized his pickup truck, and arrested him, despite his father's claims that his son hadn't left the house that night. After spending Christmas and New Year in jail, the young man underwent a polygraph test, which he passed successfully. Following Brian's release, numerous rumors circulated about the case, but no new suspects emerged. During the summer of 1996, after nearly 300 interrogations, detectives were forced to acknowledge that they no longer had even a single worthwhile lead. Bill and Linda sank deeper into despair. Bill restrained himself from interrogating every teenager he encountered in town. Linda would sit in her car and drive to the place where Adrienne was found at night, hoping to encounter her killer. It seemed that the case would never be solved. Then, suddenly, on August 29, 1996, a lawyer from the military academy in Annapolis contacted the investigators inquiring about any unsolved teenage girl murder cases involving a girl named Adrienne. Naturally, the investigators responded affirmatively, asking for more details. It turned out that 2 female cadets at the academy had made a horrifying statement to senior officers related to a murder in Texas. Their roommate, Diane Zamora, confessed to them that her boyfriend would never cheat on her because they were bound by a murder. Investigators immediately flew to Annapolis, but Diane didn't confess to anything, stating that the story was merely an attempt to gain more respect among other cadets. However, the police didn't stop there. They flew to Colorado to speak with Diane's boyfriend at the Air Force Academy. The young man insisted he didn't know why she would fabricate such a blatant lie. They didn't believe him and continued questioning. David, yes, that same David Graham from Adrienne's cross-country running team at school. The David she allegedly spoke to on the phone on the night of the murder, according to Adrienne's mother. But Stacy said she spoke with Brian, so what was the truth? To find the answer, they needed to delve into the past of David and Diane. David had always intrigued his classmates. With his military-style haircut, straight posture, and excellent manners, he seemed like a person from another era. After witnessing an air show once in his life, David made up his mind to become a USAF pilot and never wavered from his dream. Many girls at school were interested in dating him, but few knew he was already taken. His girlfriend's name was Diane Zamora, attending school in the neighboring town. She was just as intelligent, athletic, and disciplined as David, Every spare moment was dedicated to studying because she dreamed of becoming an astronaut, requiring top grades. Like her boyfriend, she participated in cross-country running competitions. Anyone who saw David and Diane together knew they were destined for a bright future. Their relationship was far more serious than teenage infatuation. In September, about a month after they began dating, they informed Diane's parents that they were engaged. They planned to tie the knot on August 13, 2000, after completing their military education. The wedding was already envisioned. David in uniform, Diane in a white wedding dress, and at the ceremony's conclusion, they would pass under crossed swords held by their cadet friends. Their families were amazed by the seriousness of their relationship, which only deepened over time. David and Diane were so absorbed in each other's lives, almost obsessed. Diane even decided to attend the Air Force Academy alongside David, setting aside her own plans. However, when she missed the deadline for application, she enrolled at the U.S. Naval Academy, intending to transfer closer to her boyfriend later. Upon their acceptance into their respective academies, David and Diane became part of an elite group of American teenagers. Yet, to solidify their place in these prestigious institutions, they had to endure grueling summer training designed to rid them of civilian habits and instill military discipline. For the newcomers, these 6 weeks consisted of constant marching, running, push-ups, and strict adherence to orders. David excelled in basic training in Colorado Springs. According to Diane's letters to her family, she was also doing well in Annapolis. However, her squadron commander, Jay Guild, a likable cadet from Chicago, mentioned that Diane was physically falling behind the others because she always seemed emotionally detached. She kept reminiscing about David, missing him, but spoke about him strangely, as if she didn't trust him yet still wanted to be with him. David and Diane, once completely confident in their commitment to each other, seemed to have lost control of the situation. On one summer day, Jay asked Diane if David had ever cheated on her. She answered yes. When asked what she did about it, she said she asked David to kill another girl. Shocked, Jay listened to the story of how David killed a girl named Adrienne. Despite the strict moral principles of the academy, Jay didn't tell anyone about the conversation, for which he later paid the price in his dream of becoming an officer. He claimed he didn't want to believe her and thought the girl was just seeking attention, but at the end of August, Diane repeated her story to her 2 roommates. The girls talked, and one suddenly said that Diane and David were so close that it seemed they would even kill for each other. Diane confessed that they had killed before. Then, either out of guilt or pride, she told them the story about Adrienne. At first, the girls were skeptical about their roommate's story, but the next day, they informed a senior officer. He contacted the academy's attorney, who began calling police stations in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, inquiring about any unsolved murders of teenage girls. On August 29th, they contacted the police in Mansfield, immediately after which investigators flew to Annapolis. Although David tried to deny the accusations, the police managed to find out that his friend held a terrible secret. On the day of Adrienne's murder, David and Diane came to him at night in blood-stained clothes. Then the senior officers of the Air Force Academy told the young cadet that it was his duty to tell the whole truth, and the guy surrendered. He sat in front of the word processor and typed a confession spanning 5 pages. David wrote that on one weekend in November, he went to regional tryouts in Lubbock with other members of Mansfield High School's cross-country team. The school provided them with a large van for the trip. Naturally, Adrienne Jones, a member of the girls' team, also went to the tryouts. In many ways, Adrienne was the complete opposite of Diane. Despite her impressive academic and athletic achievements, she was an outgoing girl who knew how to charm any guy. However, nobody noticed anything between David and Adrienne during the tryouts. They didn't sit together, didn't talk, and as Adrienne's friends claimed, she intentionally kept her distance because she had high moral principles and would never draw attention from another girl's boyfriend. But according to David, something did happen when they returned to Mansfield. David gave the girl a ride home, but they didn't go straight to her house. They parked behind the elementary school where they spent some time together, enjoying each other's company, a brief but fatal adventure for this story. It was an impulsive mistake, and for a month after that night, David was plagued by guilt and shame. His perfect and pure relationship with Diane was tainted by one girl who stole our purity. Finally, he confessed everything to Diane, For at least an hour, she screamed so much that he was afraid for her. She screamed that she wished he never existed, that Adrienne never existed, then screamed that he should kill her. David hardly expected anything like that, but he agreed to fulfill her demand. After Diane's ultimatum, I hesitated long and hard to commit the crime. I was stupid, but I was in love, he wrote in his confession. David admitted that he called Adrienne on the night of December 4th, 1995, and told her he wanted to meet. He picked her up in a Mazda Protégé belonging to Diane's parents. Diane hid in the back. Parking the car on a remote road, the two attacked the girl. Diane hit her with David's dumbbell, but Adrienne managed to escape through the window and ran away. Panicking, David grabbed a 9mm Marikov pistol and ran after Adrienne. When it was all over, the two left. The only thing they said to each other was a confession of mutual love. Then Diane's thirst for revenge suddenly faded, and she said they shouldn't have done it. The young killers went to David's friend, who lived in the neighboring town of Burleson, and tapped on the window. In blood-stained clothes, they climbed into his room through the window. As David's friend recounted, David begged him not to ask questions. It was obvious that both David and Diane were extremely upset. They cleaned themselves in the bathroom, then lay down on the floor and just held each other tight. Initially, David's friend did not report the incident to the police, and David and Diane returned to their normal lives. In the spring, they learned that they had been accepted into educational institutions. David was admitted to the Air Force Academy, and Diane to the Naval Academy. On the attic of David's parents' house, the police found weapons and several dumbbells confirming David's confession. After that, it was Diane's turn to make a statement. Her version of events fully coincided with David's words. In her notebook, the police found an entry, December 4th, Adrienne, 1:38 a.m., and in the parents' car, the blood of the deceased girl. She was placed in a cell. She looked like an innocent girl in a sleeveless shirt and blue jeans. She continued to do push-ups and squats and asked her mother to bring her textbooks so she could study. For the abduction and murder, David and Diane faced the possibility of the highest punishment. However, Adrienne's parents believed that the loss of one young life was sufficient and requested the prosecutors to insist on a life sentence. The young individuals were tried separately, and their lawyers promised to pin the blame on the other defendant. Although initially it seemed that David and Diane would never agree to this, because they promised that nothing would ever come between them. Diane broke this promise initially. However, she failed to persuade the court that David committed the crime, and she had no involvement. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. The trial against David concluded in a similar manner. However, during the hearing, a witness emerged whose testimony had the impact of a bombshell. The girl had attended the regional cross-country meet with Adrienne and David. After returning to Mansfield, supposedly when David dropped Adrienne off home and allegedly cheated on Diane, it was this witness who actually drove Adrienne home. Astonishingly, apart from a few of Adrienne's closest associates, no one ever questioned David's words regarding his connection with the girl, although this statement didn't influence the verdict. It became entirely perplexing why David confessed to Diane about infidelity that never occurred. In interviews after the trial, he affirmed that there was nothing between him and Adrienne. He simply wanted to make his girlfriend jealous. If he retracted his words, she simply wouldn't have believed him. This story shook the entire country. The shocking truth left everyone astonished at what was happening with the best and brightest youth in the country. How did David and Diane convince each other that only death could erase the stain from their pristine teenage love? How could they think that infidelity was a far worse crime than murder? Various thoughts were expressed. David's lawyer believed that his client wrote the confession to protect Diane, and some investigators agreed, believing that Diane had an influence on David, compelling him to fulfill all her desires. Others believed that David, who introduced weapons and infidelity into Diane's life, once wholly dedicated to studying, made her his accomplice in a heinous crime, binding their fates forever. There was also the police's third theory that David, wanting to prove he didn't love Adrienne, fired one shot, while Diane, consumed by rage, fired the second. However, these are just speculations, so it remains only a matter of conjecture. Would they have become criminals if they had never met? The Bermuda Islands are a British territory in the western part of the Atlantic Ocean, located about 1,000 kilometers away from the coast of the USA. It is not a country in the traditional sense, nor is it a state with a developing economy. The Bermuda Islands can boast one of the highest per capita income levels in the world. The country takes pride in its safety for travelers, stunning beaches with pink sand and golf courses. Thanks to these attractions, it annually attracts 500,000 tourists, primarily from the USA. With a small population and low crime rates, local newspapers have always written about tourism and local entertainment, but only until the summer of 1996, when the world was shocked by the murder of a young tourist from Canada, and the subsequent injustice cast a shadow over the idyllic islands. In June 1996, 16-year-old Rebecca Middleton from Belleville, Canada, graduated from the 11th grade with top grades as she had worked hard for it. Rebecca, or Becky, was the youngest daughter of David and Cindy Middleton, who had separated when she was 13 years old. Fortunately, her parents had divorced amicably, and the children enjoyed spending time with both their father and mother. Being an active girl, Rebecca had a passion for water sports, loved sailing, and was involved in windsurfing. She loved spending time with friends, but always remembered the boundaries she shouldn't cross. In general, one could say that many parents dream of having such a daughter, cheerful, active, full of life, yet responsible. This is precisely why David and Cindy reluctantly allowed Rebecca to fly to the Bermuda Islands with her best friend, Jasmine Means. Jasmine's father, Rick Means, lived on the main island, and the girls were supposed to stay at his house and be under his care throughout the vacation. Nevertheless, it took a year of negotiations and communication between the parents over the phone before Cindy and David were convinced that they could let their daughter go so far. However, Becky's parents had no significant reasons to worry. Bermuda had traditionally been considered the safest place for a vacation. On June 20th, 1996, Becky and Jasmine set off for a 6-week vacation. It was a dream journey, and for the first 2 weeks, the girls thoroughly enjoyed it. How could it be otherwise? Picturesque islands surrounded by crystal-clear ocean waters that invited exploration. And then there were endless opportunities to sunbathe on the beach with its astonishing pink sand. On June 27th, Becky celebrated her 17th birthday far from her family. However, Jasmine, Rick, and his wife Lynn ordered a beautiful cake and made every effort to ensure that the celebration would be unforgettable for the guests. During their vacation, the girls met 3 young men from the UK. Also visiting for the summer, Russell McCann, Ben Turtle, and Jonathan Cassidy, whose father was a police officer who had been transferred to the island from Britain. On July 2, 1996, it was Russell's turn to celebrate his birthday. The young group had planned to arrive by boat, but the weather interfered with their plans, and due to the rain, they had to abandon that idea. At the last moment, they decided to go to a pub. To celebrate Russell's birthday, the young people chose the oldest and most respected pub, which also happened to be a seafood restaurant. On the Bermuda Islands, alcoholic beverages could be ordered starting from the age of 18. Nevertheless, the girls had a few glasses of beer and cocktails. After leaving the pub, the young people decided to take a walk to their friend's house in the town of St. George's to the east of the main island. They spent some time at their friend's house, but when it was time to return home, the girls were slightly delayed, and they missed the time when they should have called Rick to pick them up. Moreover, Becky and Jasmine had had a few drinks and were worried that Rick would be upset. That's why, at 1:08, the girls called a taxi and went to wait for it on the street. When the taxi didn't show up by 1:45, the girls returned to their friend's house and called the taxi service again. The operator told them that the taxi had come, but the driver hadn't seen them, so he had left. After waiting on the street for another half hour, Jasmine and Becky called again at 2:16 in the morning. Jonathan Cassidy waited with them for a while, but decided to go inside the house and go to sleep. He left them waiting for the taxi, being confident that the taxi would arrive soon. Perhaps he thought they could return to the house and knock. The other guys were already asleep. By this time, dawn was approaching, and the girls were getting nervous. They were sure that Rick would scold them when they got home. In reality, Rick wasn't too angry or extremely concerned. After all, it was not unusual for teenagers to lose track of time while celebrating a birthday, and it was hard for him to imagine that anything could happen in a place as safe as Bermuda. It never crossed his mind that something might go wrong. While Jasmine and Rebecca were standing on the street, the lights in their friend's house went out, signaling that everyone had gone to sleep and it would be inconvenient to knock on their door again. At this moment, a local acquaintance of theirs, 21-year-old Dean Lattimore, arrived on a motorcycle. He asked them if they needed a taxi, to which the girls replied that they had already called one and were waiting for it to arrive. They had only talked for about 2 minutes when another motorcycle approached from the opposite direction, carrying 2 local guys. They seemed to recognize Dean and gave him a nod of greeting. The young men asked the girls what they were doing on the street at that time in a small town where they obviously weren't locals. The motorcycle driver showed a clear interest in Rebecca and complimented her on the necklace that Jasmine had given her. The guys assured the girls that the taxi wouldn't come, and they offered to give them a ride. Jasmine reasoned that they didn't have helmets, and they didn't want any trouble because of it. The guys replied that they had 1 spare helmet. Another one was found with Dean. Honestly, Rebecca and Jasmine didn't want to get on the motorcycle with unfamiliar guys, but it was clear they had no better option. Mobile phones weren't common at the time. There were no nearby payphones, and the buses wouldn't start running for several hours, and the taxi still hadn't arrived. What choice did they have? Of course, they could have woken up their friends and called Jasmine's dad, but the girls dismissed that idea. Since Jasmine was slightly bigger in build than Rebecca, she sat on Dean's motorcycle, and Rebecca sat on the other motorcycle between the 2 guys. All of them set off. The guy's motorcycle with Rebecca on it was in front, and Dean and Jasmine followed behind. Jasmine had asked Dean not to rush, and he carefully drove her. As a result, the guys on the other motorcycle quickly distanced themselves. At the bridge, Dean chose a shorter route, and around 2:30 in the morning, Jasmine was already home. She was surprised that her friends were not there yet, as Rebecca should have arrived before her. The spare key was in its place by the door, and the door to the house was locked. With growing anxiety, Jasmine waited for Rebecca. Finally, unable to wait any longer, she went to her dad and said that she had lost Rebecca. Rick couldn't understand how the girls could have separated, but he got in the car, and they began to look for Rebecca. Jasmine was too scared to admit to her dad that her friend had gotten on the motorcycle with 2 completely unfamiliar guys. She only said that she had last seen her on the bridge. While Jasmine and her father were looking for Rebecca near the bridge where Jasmine had last seen her, about 13 kilometers away, 4 friends were driving along Ferry Reach Road after a pleasant evening. Dana Rollins, a club DJ, was behind the wheel. Suddenly, the car's headlights caught sight of a figure lying in the darkness on the road. Dana got out of the car and cautiously approached. He saw that it was a young girl, a teenager. She was partially undressed, lying with her back to the car, curled up in a ball. The girl was covered in blood, and it appeared that she had been attacked before she managed to crawl to the road. She couldn't speak due to a deep wound on her throat, but attempted to say something. Dana tried to stop the bleeding and encouraged the girl to hold on and save her energy for help. At the same time, his friends drove to the nearest payphone to call for an ambulance, while Jasmine and her father were searching for Rebecca at the bridge, where Jasmine last saw her. An ambulance sped past them. Jasmine sensed that the ambulance was going to pick up Rebecca and told her father so. However, Rick cut his daughter off, not allowing her to even think that something bad could have happened. The ambulance arrived fairly quickly, but was still late. The medics couldn't do anything to help Rebecca. When Rick and Jasmine returned home, the sun had risen. Rick immediately called the police to report Rebecca's disappearance. The responding officer informed him that they would have to wait for 24 hours before they could file a missing person report. Rick argued with the officer, trying to convince him that Rebecca could not have simply gone somewhere when she suddenly received word that he was placed on hold. When the officer returned to the call, he asked Rick to come to Ferry Reach Road. Rick inquired if they had found Becky, but the only response he received was, "Go to the bridge." In frustration, Rick hung up the phone, and he and his daughter drove to the indicated location. Even from a distance, they spotted numerous police cars and officers, clearly working at a crime scene. Rick got out of the car and asked his daughter to wait for him. He didn't want her to see what he feared he would find beyond the police barricade. Approaching the scene, Rick noticed a body bag. Investigators unzipped the bag and asked him if he could identify the person inside. Rick admitted that Rebecca had been so severely injured and had lost so much blood that he had to look a second time before he could tell the investigators that it was her. He attempted to embrace her, but the police officers pulled him away. Hysterics overcame him, and he cried out in pain and despair, striking the police van in disbelief. Jasmine, who was still sitting in the car, heard her father's screams and realized that Rebecca was no more. On the way back home, both father and daughter were in a deeply sorrowful state. Rick didn't know how to tell Rebecca's parents that their daughter was dead, not just dead, but brutally murdered. How could he tell them that he hadn't protected their daughter, whom he had promised to take care of? Having given Rick the opportunity to inform Rebecca's family, the investigators wanted to speak with him and his daughter. It's difficult to imagine the horror that overcame Rick when Jasmine informed the police that Rebecca had gotten on a motorcycle with two strangers. This was the first time he had heard of it. Jasmine didn't know their names, only that they were two young men on a motorcycle, a description that could fit many local men. She knew Dean, the one who had driven her home, but not the other two. The brutal murder of a young Canadian tourist on Bermuda, a place heavily dependent on tourism, could have had a significant impact on the country's economy. Therefore, there would have been immense pressure on the investigators to solve the case as quickly as possible. However, the inexperience of many of the investigators, as well as potential breaches of standard police procedures, complicated the collection of evidence. Nevertheless, they managed to gather evidence at the crime scene. Rebecca's bustier had been cut from her shoulders, and her skirt was torn in the front. The necklace that had caught the attention of the men was nowhere to be found, possibly taken by the perpetrators as a souvenir. Typically, in cases of suspicious deaths in Bermuda, an autopsy is conducted by an outside expert. However, in this case, the autopsy was performed by a local hospital pathologist, who openly acknowledged a potential lack of skills and experience for such work. Still, the authorities pushed for haste, and he concluded that Rebecca had been subjected to brutal violence before her death, suffering deep wounds that affected vital organs, including the neck wound, which led to her demise due to shock and severe bleeding. 4 men who found Rebecca's body were questioned and quickly ruled out as suspects. The police promised Rebecca's parents to find her killer as soon as possible and devoted all their efforts to the search, investigating local young men with legal troubles. After that, they invited Dean for identification, but even here, they deviated from the standard police procedure. There was no two-way mirror or opaque barrier between Dean and the suspects, nothing that would allow the witness's identity to remain hidden. What was even more horrifying was that Dean recognized one of the guys who had driven Becky, but he knew how dangerous and vengeful that person was. He was afraid for his family, his son, and ultimately for his own life, so he claimed that the guys were wearing helmets and he didn't see their faces. Following the unsuccessful identification, the police, in a hurry to apprehend the culprits, offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of the criminals. They continued to interrogate potential suspects when a breakthrough occurred on July 9th, 6 days after the crime. Dean decided that what had happened was too terrible to let the killers escape punishment, and, despite his fear, he provided the investigators with the names of the guys who had approached the girls on a motorcycle that evening. They were 21-year-old Jamaican native Kirk Mundy and 17-year-old Justice Smith. Kirk had just been released from prison on bail awaiting trial for a bank robbery case. Justice Smith came from a decent family but had dropped out of school and was getting into trouble after associating with Kirk. The guys were arrested and charged with Rebecca's murder. In Bermuda, 17-year-old Justice could be tried as an adult, so they faced the highest possible punishment if convicted. Shortly after that, another witness contacted the police. He explained that he and a friend had a breakdown near the crime scene. While they were waiting for assistance, Justice and Kirk pulled over to chat with them. The witness stated that Kirk appeared unusually disheveled, and there was blood on his shirt. Nevertheless, Kirk and Justice continued to deny any involvement and insisted that they were nowhere near that road. Justice claimed they were at a nightclub, while Kirk stated that he was at home with his girlfriend, who was expecting a child. The police collected DNA samples from the two and sent them to a laboratory in Canada for testing. While awaiting the test results, another witness emerged, having seen the two guys on the motorcycle at 3:20 in the morning. He noticed that a white piece of fabric covered the motorcycle's registration number. Interestingly, the white vest that Rebecca was wearing that evening was never found. Kirk Mundy knew that he was facing a serious charge for murder. Understanding that he was linked to the crime scene and that his DNA was being analyzed, he requested a meeting with a lawyer. The lawyer directly told him that if his DNA matched the semen found on the girl, his alibi of being at home would be completely disproven. In response, Kirk decided to provide a statement to the prosecutor, admitting that he had assaulted the girl and that Eustace had killed her, making him an involuntary accomplice to the crime. Kirk revealed that he had thrown the knife, used in the murder, into the water from a bridge. The prosecutor's office, under immense pressure to solve the case, quickly struck a deal with Kirk before waiting for the DNA test results in exchange for his testimony against Eustace. In court, Kirk apologized before being sentenced to 5 years in prison for his involvement in the crime. The remarkably lenient sentence deeply upset Rebecca's parents, but their nightmare was far from over. Just 2 days after this sentence, the results of the DNA comparison arrived. Justice Smith's DNA was not found at the crime scene. Only Kirk Mundy's DNA was present. Kirk had humiliated the girl and at the very least had participated in her murder. Kirk had outwitted the prosecutor, the police, and probably his own lawyer, as they all believed him. The prosecutor confronted Kirk, demanding an explanation for how his DNA ended up on the girl. Kirk claimed that as they were riding on the motorcycle, Rebecca whispered that she was willing to be intimate with him. After he fulfilled her wish, he claimed he walked to the water to wash up when he suddenly heard Rebecca scream, "No!" He rushed back, and it appeared as though Eustace was striking her in the face. However, a few seconds later, he noticed that she was bleeding from her throat. They quickly fled on the motorcycle. The prosecutor did not believe a word of Kirk's story and attempted to accuse him of intentionally murdering Rebecca, but it was too late. By law, a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime. Kirk slipped through the prosecutor's fingers. The prosecutors decided to at least seek justice in the case against Justice Smith. There was no sign of his semen on Rebecca, possibly because he used a condom. 2 condom wrappers were found near the crime scene, but such evidence wouldn't be admissible in court. Therefore, the most crucial piece of evidence became the knife, approximately 10 centimeters long with a broad blade, that the culprits had discarded from the bridge. The prosecution called on renowned American pathologist Michael Baden to examine it, who also re-examined the autopsy results. He explained that when a serrated knife makes contact with skin, it leaves markings as unique as fingerprints. The wounds on Rebecca's body matched the knife found under the bridge. In Justice's home, a set of relatively rare knives from the same manufacturer as the murder weapon was discovered, missing 1 knife. The evidence continued to mount, but proving anything was difficult because the initial autopsy had been conducted with errors. For instance, the body had been washed before the examination was completed. Additionally, no skin samples from the attacker's nails were taken from Rebecca. These samples could have revealed who she had struggled with before her death: Kirk, Justice, or both. However, based on his experience, the pathologist concluded that the person responsible for her death was not acting alone. The pathologist's analysis indicated that before Rebecca's murder, she had suffered shallow but highly distressing and emotionally intimidating wounds, which he referred to as Jamaican torture. The distinct edges of these wounds and the absence of cuts on the girl's hands suggested that one assailant held her head and arms behind her, while the other used the serrated knife to scratch and cut her forehead. She was on her knees at the time, and her tormentor loomed over her. The pathologist believed that these torturous wounds were meant to coerce the girl into doing things during the attack that she had initially resisted. After the attacker obtained what he wanted, he slashed her throat with the knife. Rebecca died within minutes, and due to her internal injuries, she wouldn't have been able to make it to the road by herself. Again, 2 people had to carry her. The bruises on her wrists and smudges on her boots pointed clearly to 2 individuals. After this ordeal, the perpetrators left her to die from blood loss. In November 1998, the trial of Justice Smith began, and his parents hired a lawyer from Britain to defend their son. Suddenly, a week before the trial, the lead prosecutor left the Bermuda Islands, and his replacement had little time to prepare for the trial. Complicating matters, all the evidence against Eustace was circumstantial. Nevertheless, the evidence appeared to be quite reliable. The last time Rebecca was seen, Kirk and Justice were taking her on a motorcycle, and they were identified by Dean. Witnesses connected the guys to the crime scene. The pathologist clearly stated that 2 individuals were involved in the crime. The murder weapon matched a set of knives in Eustace's kitchen. Shouldn't that have been enough? After the prosecution finished presenting the case, Eustace's lawyer didn't call a single witness. He simply argued that there was no semen, hair, fiber, or blood that could link Eustace to the murder or violence, and thus the case against him should be dismissed, and the jury should be discharged. Nobody expected what would happen next. Out of the blue, The news broke that the judge had agreed with the defense's arguments and was discharging the jury. Justice Smith walked out of the courtroom as a free man. Rebecca's parents were in shock. Cindy rushed out of the courtroom and David sat there, unable to move. Many in the courtroom were brought to tears by the injustice. Naturally, the prosecutor filed an appeal, arguing that the judge had not considered the circumstantial evidence, which was substantial. The Bermuda Court of Appeal ordered a new trial for Justice, but this decision was challenged in the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council of the United Kingdom, acting as the country's highest court. They ruled that Justice could not be tried a second time for the same offense. Their decision was final, putting an end to any further appeals. In 2002, Justice Smith attacked 2 women with a knife, injuring one of them. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison, but the judge released him, considering the time he had already spent in custody. Kirk Mundy served 20 years in prison for a robbery he was initially charged with before Rebecca's murder and for weapons possession. Upon his release, he was deported to Jamaica. Since nobody faced punishment for Rebecca's murder, the nightmare for her family continued. They deserved more. Every day, her family would come to the courthouse, hoping and waiting for justice. In the following years, Rebecca's family desperately sought justice for their daughter. They made several attempts to reopen the case, but in 2008, David announced that he could no longer financially support the battle against Bermuda's legal system. Ironically, 10 years after the murder, the government of the island compensated the Middleton family for the pain and suffering they endured, cutting a check for $2,840. Megan Carr and Cherish DeSantis seemed destined to become best friends. The girls were born just a day apart, attended the same school, clubs, and activities together, and their parents thought each of them had 2 daughters. Both of their families were quite wealthy. Megan's father owned and managed a company specializing in drilling water wells. It had been a family business since the 1940s, bringing in around $2 million annually. However, by 1992, Megan's parents had divorced, and she lived with her mom, Shirley. As for Cherish's father, he was a well-known tobacco auctioneer in town and nationwide for over 30 years. While such auctions are not as common now, back then, it was a thriving business. In the spring of 1992, 16-year-old Megan and Cherish were popular students at Thomasville High School in Georgia. Their families made sure their daughters behaved appropriately, although there was never a need for concern. The girls never caused trouble, excelled in their studies, and all their activities were within the bounds of propriety. Even during vacations, they looked forward to peaceful beach getaways rather than raucous parties. Thursday, March 26, 1992, marked the last day before spring break. After that, students could forget about school until April 6th. Megan and Cherish were eager to squeeze in some beach time. Not in Thomasville, of course, but in Florida, less than 60 kilometers away. For Thomasville students, crossing the border to visit the beaches of Tallahassee was a common practice. It took about 2 hours and the trip was quite enjoyable. The young women preferred a single beach that wasn't overrun by tourists. It was called Bold Point, a picturesque 13-kilometer shoreline, popular for birdwatching, wildlife, and yes, alligators, hence its name. Overall, it was a wonderful spot to relax under the sun and take a swim. That was Megan and Cherish's plan. Therefore, at 10 o'clock on Friday morning, the girls packed their swimsuits, towels, and, hopping into Megan's new Honda, headed for Florida, planning to spend the entire day at the beach. They intended to return home that same evening. Some of their friends were supposed to join them, but at the last moment, some had second thoughts or urgent matters came up. The girls arrived at Alligator Point Beach around noon. Megan parked the car, they grabbed their towels, changed into their bikinis, and turned on the rock station on the boombox. After wandering leisurely along the beach for a few hours, a married couple noticed the girls and, seeing that they were resting in a somewhat unusual pose, one girl lying on top of the other, decided not to disturb them. The couple veered wide around them to avoid causing any disturbance. However, on their way back, they realized that the girls hadn't moved at all. Even as they openly stared at them for minutes, the girls remained still. The man asked his wife to stay put while he approached them closer. He saw blood and shouted to his wife that the girls appeared to be dead and they needed to call the police. Alligator Point Beach was a family-friendly beach where visitors enjoyed walks and picnics. The police were aware that there had never been attacks on women at this beach. Therefore, the arriving officers were also horrified by what had happened. The ongoing contrast of the radio continuing to play rock music added to the chilling atmosphere of the murder scene juxtaposed against the carefree beach setting. The officers found the girls' identification and conducted a preliminary identification. They were 16-year-old Megan and Cherish. In addition to their documents, all their belongings were nearby: wallets, cash, Megan's car keys, beach bags, and towels. The girls were in bikinis, so the police ruled out robbery or violence against them as motives. Megan had a towel draped over her head soaked in her blood. Cherish lay on Megan with a head wound as well. As later determined by the medical examiner, each girl had been shot twice in the head from close range with a .38 caliber firearm. There was a lot of blood around the bodies. Besides the bullet holes, there were no other injuries on the victims, as if they had been caught off guard and didn't fight for their lives. Therefore, reluctantly, the police had to consider whether this was someone the girls knew. It seemed unlikely that a stranger could have approached so closely without the victims screaming or attempting to escape. And who could have known they would be relaxing in this isolated part of the beach? It appeared that the attack was planned, and someone had been monitoring them and traveled all the way from home. But who would want to kill two schoolgirls? The police began interviewing possible witnesses among local residents and regular beachgoers because although it was a remote part of the beach, families were nearby and cars were parked in the lot. They should have heard gunshots or the victims' cries. One regular beachgoer indeed heard sounds around 12:30 that he mistook for fireworks. Now, of course, it was evident he had heard 4 gunshots. Shortly afterward, a car passed by him that he hadn't seen there before. It was a long blue car resembling a Chevrolet Nova or something similar. Officers also went to the parking lot where Megan's car was parked and noticed something strange. There were plenty of open parking spots, but someone had blocked Megan's car in such a way that she couldn't leave. It wasn't a Chevrolet, but the car turned out to be blue. Approaching, the officers saw a man inside with a camera on his lap. When asked what he was doing there, the man explained that he had been photographing birds in the area all day. He had seen people, of course, but not teenage girls dancing on the beach. He rather aggressively stated that he had no interest in watching girls dance on the beach. Curiously, who mentioned anything about dancing on the beach? The man was taken in for questioning and a weapon was found in his trunk. The police were already rubbing their hands, thinking they had quickly solved the case. During questioning, the man admitted he had seen the girls but denied any involvement in the murders, claiming they were alive when he passed by them on the beach. He even underwent a polygraph test. The gun found in his trunk turned out to be a completely different caliber than the murder weapon, so the suspect was released. The bartender from the establishment near the beach where the girls died recalled a strange incident that occurred on the day of the murders involving an unusual visitor. He entered as soon as the establishment opened, ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail, but the bartender wasn't quite ready for service due to a delay, so she told the man the drink would be on the house. However, he insisted on paying. This alone wouldn't have been odd, except for his words. "You'd better take this money because it's the first and last time I'll come in here." Whether he meant to offend her or not, he stayed in the bar for 40 minutes and left shortly before the presumed time of Megan and Cherish's murders. Meanwhile, it was getting dark, approaching dinner time, when Megan and Cherish were expected home, but they hadn't returned. Megan's mother called Cherish's parents to see if her daughter was with them, but they hadn't seen her either. The woman was a bit worried, but she knew the girls were responsible and assumed they were just running a bit late. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The Florida police notified their colleagues in Thomasville about what had happened and asked them to inform the families of the victims. How can anyone prepare someone for the news that their loved one will never come home again? It was a tragedy for both families. They felt as though they had lost 2 daughters. Although the officers tried to be as tactful as possible, they needed to ask several questions. The girls' relatives explained that they spent almost all their time together, either at Megan's house or Cherish's. The only other person they spent a lot of time with was Alex, Cherish's boyfriend. The families insisted that Alex had nothing to do with the murders, but everyone was considered a suspect until ruled out by the police. Moreover, they were troubled by how the killer got so close to the girls. This meant they didn't see him as a threat. Therefore, suspicion fell on Alex next. But he seemed genuinely grieving, just like everyone else, unable to believe they were gone. The police were convinced that Alex must have known where the girls would be hanging out. He replied that he could have found out if he wanted to, but they never discussed it. Additionally, when Megan and Cherish went to the beach, He was at work in the factory. His colleagues indeed confirmed the young man's alibi, so the police left Alex alone and allowed him to mourn the loss of his girlfriend and her friend. The police had no solid leads and disclosed almost nothing to the public. Therefore, all sorts of wild rumors circulated about the motive for the murders. Some speculated that the girls were random victims of drug smuggling, with smugglers landing on the beach and killing unwanted witnesses. However, there was no evidence of any boat landing on the beach. Others recalled that the beach used to be a nudist beach and suggested the girls might have been targeted for occasionally sunbathing topless there. But Megan and Cherish were in bikinis, so this theory didn't make sense. The most plausible theory was that someone was upset about Cherish's father's tobacco business, perhaps due to a failed deal, and took out their anger on his daughter. However, the police couldn't find any evidence to support this theory. Time passed, and the police couldn't make progress. There was neither a motive nor evidence to find the culprit. Even experienced police officers didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, societal pressure was mounting. The only lead that demanded substantial police resources was the blue Chevrolet Nova. Police spoke with all owners of similar blue cars in the state of Florida. In Georgia, they couldn't do this because in 1992, the state lacked a database of car colors. Officers went door to door, interviewing car owners. Several times they felt they were onto something, such as when they discovered that an owner of a similar model lived across the street from one of the girls, or when they found a former convict acting suspiciously at the crime scene. But all these promising leads didn't amount to anything. Suddenly, a woman called the sheriff's office in Tallahassee. She claimed to know who shot the girls because she was on the beach when it happened. This call was a godsend for the police, giving them renewed hope that the case would be solved. She said the man's name was Sam Haynes, and he lived near the beach. However, when asked to identify herself, she hung up. She had called from a payphone, so tracing her location was impossible. Although the police desperately wanted to find her, as she confessed to being involved in the crime, they couldn't locate her. It turned out that despite Sam living near the beach, he was actually working at a construction site in Atlanta, Georgia, 6 hours away from the crime scene. Investigators suspected Sam might have followed the girls when they drove that day. Upon learning he was being sought, Sam contacted the police himself. He claimed he was at work in Atlanta on March 27th and insisted someone was lying about him. Sam suspected it was Linda, his ex-wife's sister. As it turned out, Sam was not mistaken. Linda accused her former brother-in-law of the high-profile murder of the two girls as revenge for mistreatment of her sister. It's remarkable she took this step, considering she could have been arrested herself. In any case, detectives spent a lot of time in vain. If it weren't for the next crucial event, they wouldn't have solved the case, no matter how hard they worked. On Friday, May 15th at 10 a.m., the sheriff's office received another call. It was a resident of Tallahassee claiming to know who killed Megan and Cherish. The killer was her ex-boyfriend, Robert Neil Rodriguez. This sounded familiar to the investigators, who had lost hope of it being anything other than another scorned ex. So they asked her why she thought he had killed someone. But the woman said he confessed himself. Robert had called her the previous evening and told her everything, convincing her he was serious. He begged her to wait until the next morning to call the police. She kept her promise. One detective thought the man's name sounded vaguely familiar and reviewed the list of people involved in the case. Robert's name was indeed on it because he owned a blue car, though not a Chevrolet Nova, but a 1979 Plymouth Volare, a model very similar to the Chevrolet. The caller couldn't provide any more information, particularly about Robert's current location, but she knew he planned to leave town and was armed. She added that he had previously lived with his mother in Tallahassee, about an hour's drive from Alligator Point Beach. Robert's neighbors confirmed he had moved out of the apartment on May 2nd or 3rd. During the search of his apartment, books on death and other items suggesting a specific, possibly depressed state of mind were found, but no weapon. The police stations around the country were informed of the new suspect's description. Meanwhile, the investigators tried to recall what Robert had told them that caused them to strike his name from the suspect list. But as they began to delve into his past, they were horrified to realize that he was a former police officer from Portland, Oregon. He served in the police force for 2 years, from 1975 to 1977. The officers were shocked because the murderer who committed such a terrible crime could have been one of them. When they approached him about his blue car, he immediately claimed to be a former police officer himself and offered to undergo a polygraph test. but the police stated that it was just a routine check and left him alone. As it turned out, they were wrong. Incredibly, just 8 hours after the woman's call at 6 p.m., the police phone rang again. This time, it was a man introducing himself as Robert Neil Rodriguez. Being a former police officer, he immediately provided his driver's license number to prove it was really him. Then Robert convinced the officer that he was the one who committed the murder. He simply confessed. Robert provided the police with information known only to the killer. For example, the fact that Megan had a towel on her face. He even said he was calling from a payphone on the road in New Mexico, heading to the Grand Canyon National Park, driving his Plymouth. Robert's voice sounded so detached and subdued that detectives feared he might do something foolish. Detectives asked him to surrender to help him, but Robert said it was too late for him and he wouldn't go to prison. He feared that as a former police officer, he would have a hard time in prison. Detectives hurried to find the man, but were also afraid to show his photo in the news. They feared that if Robert's photo appeared in the news, he might do something irreversible, or someone else might take matters into their own hands. The next morning, on May 16th in New Mexico along the route to the Grand Canyon National Park, a blue Plymouth was found on the highway. The license plates on the car were from Utah, but when they checked them, it turned out they had been stolen on May 8th from a parking lot in Utah. The car was just parked on the highway. Inside sat a man who matched the description of Robert Rodriguez. He looked as though he had lost consciousness. A vial with a white substance dangled from a leather lace around his neck, and a handwritten note lay on the dashboard. The note was addressed to anyone who found the man. In it, Robert, confirming it was indeed him, wrote that he had taken cyanide and under no circumstances should anyone try to revive him with artificial respiration, as the rescuer might get poisoned themselves. On the passenger seat was a notebook, where Robert explained in more detail that he had consumed cyanide mixed with scotch for the parents of Megan and Cherish and to avoid imprisonment. There was a gun in the car, but it was a .22 caliber, not the one used to fire the deadly bullets. However, the most intriguing part was that according to Robert's final promise, the Florida police should expect a letter from him detailing how and why he killed the girls. When the parents of the girls heard the news, they were shocked and puzzled. Megan's father wondered, could they have hired a former police officer as a hitman? He couldn't fathom the idea that a stranger could shoot his daughter just like that. He believed it must have been a professional killer. Meanwhile, Cherish's mother, upon learning about the discoveries during the search of Robert Rodriguez's home, wondered if he was a serial killer who hated women. If he was so obsessed with killings, shouldn't he have killed more than 2 people by his age? Of course, at that time, she didn't know how close to the truth she was. And then on May 18th, the first letter from Robert surfaced. It didn't go to the police, but to a newspaper. In it, he disclosed where the police should look for his body because initially Robert had intended to reach the canyon. He also claimed that he would be sought in connection with 3 committed murders. Incredibly, he admitted that the police themselves wouldn't have been able to link him to 3 murders, but he simply couldn't stay silent. In 1984, he killed another innocent girl, Valerie Hunt. That his 3rd victim was Valerie Hunt. He killed her in 1984, and the police will receive all the details about the murders by mail. Valerie was a 22-year-old student from Tallahassee. Her body was found in September of that same year near the pond. The police initially treated the case as a disappearance, possibly suspecting she had run away, but everyone who knew her didn't believe she would willingly disappear. Her boyfriend reported her disappearance when her boss called to say she hadn't shown up for work, although she was always reliable. Like Megan and Cherish, Valerie went to the pond to swim and sunbathe. She frequented the area often, was a strong swimmer, and it was incredible that she drowned. The cause of her death was undetermined because her body was heavily decomposed. Now, finally, it became clear that she was Robert Rodriguez's first victim. On the 19th, finally, a letter arrived at the police, after which Robert's messages were received by the families of all his victims, his friends, and former girlfriends with whom he had good relationships. The police didn't disclose the details of the message until they had verified every word from the man. They asked the families of the girls to do the same, but Megan's father decided differently. He saw both letters, Megan and Cherish's families, and said they were practically identical, with no hint of an apology in either. Robert revealed the details of how he committed the crime, although Megan's father would have preferred him not to. On March 27th, around noon, Robert entered a cafe near Alligator Point Beach. It was he who ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail and insisted on paying for it. The bartender confirmed this when she saw his picture. He left the establishment around 1 p.m. and headed to the beach. Witnesses who found the bodies passed Megan and Cherish at 1:45, and they were already dead. That is, after leaving the bar, he immediately went to the beach where he saw the girls and killed them. He was haunted by a fantasy in which he raped, beat, and killed a girl. These thoughts had plagued him for a long time, and he couldn't find an explanation or justification for this obsession. And though he dreamed of violence, he assured the police and the girls' families that he hadn't done anything like that to Valerie, Megan, or Cherish. After killing Valerie, he told himself he could live a normal life, and that if he did it again, he would kill himself. And then, when he came across Megan and Cherish, he couldn't hold back. They did nothing to provoke him. He had never met them before, but chose them because they were young, attractive, and vacationing in a remote area. It was all over in seconds. He shot Megan first. Cherish began to scream and back away. Then he shot her. Megan had a towel in her hand and it fell over her head when he shot. Then he shot each one more time to make sure they were dead before fleeing. All the letters were written matter-of-factly, and there was practically no emotion in them. It must have been very difficult to read them. Megan's mom again raised the question that worried everyone. How could he harbor this passion for murder for 8 long years before killing again? Megan's father speculated that Robert became engrossed in religion, then lost faith again, and therefore killed again. But investigators noticed another interesting pattern. He divorced shortly before Valerie's murder in 1984. And he had just broken up with his girlfriend before Megan and Cherish's murders. One of his church friends said he sometimes got angry about relationships. Maybe that's how he vented his anger. And his mother died on Easter morning in 1992, and since he no longer had any truly close people, he decided to confess everything. The pastor of his church said Robert was struggling internally. His loving and caring nature fought against the evil inside him. He stuttered about suicide at least twice, and he was taking medication previously used to treat depression, but its effect was linked to aggressive behavior and thoughts of harming himself. When people gathered for service on Sunday, May 17th, and didn't see Robert, they couldn't believe what they had learned about him. They called him Bob, sincerely loved him, helped others, and he wasn't the person they read about in the news. One woman said it was so much like him, warning that he had taken cyanide. Another admitted she wouldn't be able to read news about criminals and judge them as before because she knew one personally. She will think about the people who loved this man, because they exist, and she is one of them. It's clear that Robert didn't understand the reason behind his obsession and didn't want to harm innocent strangers. It's unfortunate that he couldn't overcome his inner demons and stop himself before taking the lives of 3 innocent individuals, Valerie Hunt, Megan Carr, and Cherish DeSantis, and breaking the hearts of both their loved ones and his own. Christmas 2017 didn't start off well for the Aguilar family from Elche, Spain. The family owns a bakery, so the holidays are the busiest time for their business. Spouses Rosa and Alberto Aguilar decided not to keep all the earnings at home and took them to the bank. But when Rosa approached the cupboard where the family kept the money, only small change fell out of the pouch. 6,000 or 7,000 euros were missing. The spouses were afraid they had been robbed, but the door lock was intact, and there were no signs of a break-in in the house either. Then they decided that perhaps their daughter Patricia knows more. Patricia Aguilar is the eldest child of Alberto and Rosa. 2 weeks ago, she turned 18. Patricia was a typical teenager, albeit a bit introverted and shy. She studied art and spent a lot of time in her room on the computer. Her parents were worried that she had few friends and was becoming reclusive. Therefore, Rosa was very happy when her daughter said she had been invited to a birthday party. The girl left with an overnight bag and has not returned since. Her parents wrote and called her, but she did not answer. They didn't know what to think. Considering that the money went missing at the same time as Patricia, Alberto decided to contact the police. But the police were confident she would return soon and didn't rush to find the 18-year-old girl. By evening, the issue of money no longer concerned the parents. They wrote to Patricia that they wouldn't scold her as long as she returned home. That night, they couldn't close their eyes. When they finally received the message, "Everything is fine, I will contact you in a few hours," from their daughter Alberto and Rosa didn't buy it. The message was not written in the way their daughter would have done it. Now the parents were convinced that something had happened. The most likely scenario seemed to them that the thief who stole the money had kidnapped the girl and taken her phone. Rosa couldn't sit and wait, knowing that the police were not taking any action, so she went into her daughter's room and searched through all her belongings. Every book, notebook, pillow, stuffed toy. She even looked under the lamp and behind the paintings. She realized she had found what she was looking for, although it was not at all what she expected. There were some esoteric symbols, descriptions of rituals written by Patricia's hand, and also clear instructions for a trip and marriage registration in Peru with descriptions of the necessary documents. Shocked, Rosa asked her husband if their daughter had run away to Peru to get married there, with whom. The police assured them that the girl had not crossed the country's borders. The plot thickened. Among her daughter's belongings, Rosa found photos of adult women she didn't know. Then for the first time, the thought crept into her mind that a cult might be behind all this, which she hurried to share with the police. But they dismissed her again, because 2 weeks ago the girl turned legal age and could do whatever she wanted. Weeks passed without any news, and Rosa and Alberto decided to turn to the public. They understood that the internet would be of invaluable help to them in this, but the Aguilar spouses were not familiar with it. They didn't even use social networks. Therefore, they turned to Noelia, Rosa's cousin. Patricia treated her as an older sister. Noelia responded in kind, and when her help was needed without hesitation, Noelia closed her shop in Benidorm and came to Elche. It was not difficult for her to find out that Patricia had been communicating a lot with some guy who sent her lists of books on black magic and esoterica. One word appeared particularly often in her notes: gnosis. As Noelia read, the concept of Gnosticism involves the search for knowledge, truth. But in the 1950s, several groups emerged claiming that allegedly to be saved in the apocalypse, one needed to cleanse oneself of sins. This could be done by engaging in intimate relationships as often as possible. Becoming carriers of such truth, the new followers of the doctrine had to renounce their families because other people were doomed, they were enemies. After finding all this out, Patricia's relatives realized that they didn't really know the girl, and that she had been living a double life for a long time. A few more days passed, and Patricia got in touch. She wrote to Noelia that she was fine, but she wouldn't return, and attached a photo showing her holding a piece of paper with the date. She explained that she and her boyfriend were traveling in a mobile home across Europe, and they were currently in Pitești. But Pitești is in Romania, and the police assured them that the girl had not left Spanish territory. A quick search online told Noelia that on that day in Pitești, the temperature had dropped to -6 degrees Celsius, and the girl was wearing just a t-shirt. Noelia tried to call her back and found out that the girl's phone operator only serves South American countries. If, according to the police, Patricia had not left Spain, how did her phone do that? When Noelia tried to confront Patricia with this new information, she became agitated and rudely demanded to be left alone. But Noelia wasn't going to give up. In fact, the police were mistaken. On the very first day of her disappearance, when Patricia supposedly went to her friend's birthday party, she flew to Lima, Peru. After 2 years of online communication, she finally met her beloved, Stephen. He met her at the airport and immediately took her to a hotel. There, he became Patricia's first man. Thanks to the money she brought with her, they were able to rent a small apartment, where Patricia met 29-year-old Mariori Garcia Valverde and 42-year-old Paula Vega, the other, as he called them, wives of the man. Patricia knew she would become Stephen's third wife, but he didn't warn her that they would live with 4 children, Paula's daughter and 2 girls and a boy from Mariori. So 8 people ended up living in a small apartment, and there was no space for intimacy, which they were supposed to engage in every day. Stephen and Patricia met 2 years ago. It was a very difficult time for the teenage girl. Patricia had an uncle, her mother's brother, Jose. He loved his niece very much, spoiled her, spent time with her when her parents were busy. For Patricia, he was both an older brother and a father figure. However, in 2015, 29-year-old Jose fell ill. He was diagnosed with pancreatitis. People recover from this illness, but complications arose in Jose's case. He passed away within 4 months. The whole family was devastated. While Alberto was able to fully immerse himself in work, his wife Rosa and Patricia couldn't cope with the pain of loss. Rosa developed depression and found solace in simple computer games that allowed her to distract herself. Unfortunately, during this time, she distanced herself from her children and husband, and Patricia, who needed the support of her loved ones more than ever, became very vulnerable. She began to ponder what happens after death as she could not accept that death was the end. She became interested in this topic, visited relevant websites, and she met Stephen, a man with very developed communicative and manipulative abilities. He studied psychology books to know how to penetrate the consciousness of every person. He called himself a savior, a messenger facing the impending end of the world, apocalypse. He made naive girls believe that they were a couple in a past life and that his wives, his queens, had a mission to populate the world after the apocalypse. Stephen realized that Patricia was the perfect victim because she was a teenager and, as is often the case at that age, felt insecure and believed that nobody cared about her. All of this combined with her natural innocence. Stephen took advantage of her psychological vulnerability due to her uncle's death and used his persuasive methods to lure her into his traps. While her family was preoccupied, for 2 years Stephen worked on the girl's mind to isolate her, and no one noticed anything until it was too late. The girl believed she was safe because Stephen was on the other side of the globe. He gradually manipulated her, first asking for pictures in lingerie, then nude. Only after that did they discuss intimate moments, and the girl agreed that he had 2 wives. He explained this by saying that from a biological point of view, a man is created for relationships with many women, but a woman can only have one husband because a woman is a temple. Relationships with a man allow a woman to progress spiritually. A man can do this himself, but for a woman, this is the only way. And now, after 2 years of online communication, Patricia gave up everything and ran away to Stephen. He gave her a new name, Silvana, which means born in the jungle. But she had to get used not only to the new name. She had never taken forbidden substances, and Stephen made her consume a root that caused strong hallucinations. He didn't hesitate to give it to the children either. Meanwhile, the girl's family didn't give up trying to find her. They were lucky that Patricia left plenty of clues behind. Among her notes, Noelia found logins and passwords to computer games and social networks. One attracted her attention because it was repeated several times. Nicoli. It turned out to be the girl's secret page, where she expressed her thoughts about the afterlife. Among her friends, Noelia noticed a young man named Stephen Martinez, and in his friends list there were only girls, 3,000 girls, all roughly Patricia's age. Noelia suspected that he might be behind all this. It was some progress, but for now, Noelia only found the guy's name on the internet. They needed evidence. Then the girl's mother searched Patricia's room again and noticed an interesting document. It turned out to be a medical certificate issued by a hospital in Lima, Peru, in the name of Paula Vega. Rosa realized they had stumbled upon a significant lead, finding Patricia's connection to Peru. The parents turned to the police, who passed the information to Interpol and eventually to the police in Peru. Stephen became nervous when the police called Paula and asked for clarification regarding Patricia. Even before Patricia's escape, he had asked her to forge a medical certificate for Paula, but instead of destroying the copy, she put it in a drawer in her room and completely forgot about it. And now they had problems. If Paula testified, the police would start digging deeper. Stephen decided to get Patricia out of trouble. They went together to the police station. Like a vulture, he watched her every word, controlling her every move. At his direction, the girl told the officers that nobody had kidnapped her and that she wanted to live in Peru. Since Patricia was of legal age, the police saw no crime. They simply let the couple go. This disappointed the girl's family, but at least they learned Stephen's full name, Felix Stephen Manrique Gomez, and they decided to change their approach, to turn to the media. This decision changed everything. The Aguilar family wanted as many people as possible to learn about Stephen's methods, to prevent him from luring other girls into his cult. It was risky because Stephen could either send Patricia home or flee with her. As it turned out, Stephen chose the third option. As soon as he saw his face on the news program, he smashed all the phones and computers and kicked Patricia out of the apartment. He ordered her to contact the embassy to get the opportunity to contact the media and fix everything. Until then, she would be alone on the street, without food or shelter. After a few days, she managed to reach out to a TV program and give an interview live. At first, her parents were relieved to see she was alive. But the things she said broke their hearts. The girl didn't hold back her words, aiming to hurt her parents to the core. She stated that she didn't want to know Rosa and Alberto because they were bad parents. Her father was never home, her mother played computer games for days, and nobody paid attention to her, didn't feed her or buy her clothes. She considered her Uncle Jose as her real father, and essentially her grandmother raised her. Patricia demanded that they remove all information from the internet, all photos, messages about the search, and send her money. Only then would she send them her address. After that, she would decide what to do next. Finally, she told her father, "Do you know why I was so happy in the photos from my birthday? I dreamed of running away since I was 14, and now I finally could leave home." It was painful for the parents to hear this, and many of their acquaintances and even relatives believed the girl's words. After such a shocking statement, both the police and the media lost interest in the case. But her family didn't give up. Noelia decided to make the most of social media opportunities. She created a fake profile similar to Patricia's and requested to be friends with Stephen. She tried to portray herself as a teenage girl interested in esoterics, but perhaps she pressed too hard, asking for his phone number to communicate in Messenger. He suspected that she wasn't who she claimed to be, but mistook her for some Karen. He blocked her, but Noelia was already unstoppable. In Stephen's friend list, she found one Karen. It was a girl whose photo she had already seen among Patricia's belongings. Contacting her, Noelia learned that Karen had also been in the cult, but she managed to break free from Stephen's clutches. However, her sister Mai not only had been with him, but also was his only official wife. Karen confessed that she was afraid for her sister and advised reaching out to her mother Alinda. Perhaps she could help in some way. Despite Patricia partially managing to improve the situation with her interview, Stephen turned into a paranoid. He moved the girls and children to San Martin de Pangoa, a region 12 hours away from Lima by bus in the middle of the jungle. It was a dangerous place with water and electricity shortages, and they could go weeks without bathing, both adults and children. There was also a lack of money for food. The meager coins they had were spent on candles and hallucinogenic roots that Stephen used during rituals. Patricia, now called Silva, deleted all her social media accounts, cut her long hair, and dyed it black. It was tough for the fugitives. A man with 3 women and 4 children, one of whom was clearly a foreigner. Cornered, Stephen became increasingly aggressive. He began mistreating Patricia very badly. Once he even told Mai, maybe we should just kill her, but it wasn't easier for the others. He severely beat the children and girls, using a leather whip, the effect of which was like being hit by 3 whips simultaneously. He beat the children for any reason, especially Mai's son, the only boy. Patricia got tired of this quickly and told Stephen that she would leave him, to which he threatened to take his anger out on the children. Despite the girls being willing to do anything for Stephen, even give their lives for him, he soon started asking for things that were beyond even their limits. Living nearby were girls who were rumored to be night butterflies despite their young age. Mai made the mistake of mentioning this to her husband. Stephen claimed that the girls would supposedly help him with a new ritual and demanded to arrange a meeting. But Mai couldn't do it because they were underage. She even considered Patricia too young for Stephen. The man became so enraged that he grabbed his wife by the neck and began to strangle her. She was almost suffocated and couldn't breathe. He would have killed her if Patricia hadn't intervened. Only then did Stephen release his victim. Patricia felt terrible, longing to return home to her parents but afraid of what they would say after all her actions. She lost her zest for life until suddenly everything changed. She realized she was expecting a child. Many advised the Aguilar family to forget about Patricia and stop searching, but her parents decided otherwise. Rosa stayed with her younger son in Elche, while Alberto went to Peru because they couldn't achieve much from Spain. But Peru was a large country, and Alberto was a stranger there, so he sought the support of Alinda, the mother of Karen and Mai. They found a prosecutor willing to help them, and the police began investigating, treating the case as one of human trafficking. The first place the officers visited was Patricia's apartment, from where Stephen had already taken her. Alberto could barely hold himself together when neighbors told stories of often hearing screams and blows and witnessing the girls being forced into intimate relationships in front of the children. Since Stephen had taken the children out of school and away with the girls in an unknown direction, detectives decided to track their phones. Stephen was horrified at the thought of being found, so the phones were almost always turned off. All they could do was wait for someone in the group to turn on their phone. Meanwhile, investigators found out who this Stephen was. The 35-year-old man was born in Lima into a poor and troubled family. He was bullied by other boys at school, which led him to spend time only with girls. From childhood, he learned how to manipulate them. His father gave him a book that helped Stephen join the Gnostics, but he was expelled because he drew ideas from other cults and called himself a prophet. Gradually, he came to found his own cult. When Stephen and the girls ran out of money, they moved to Alto Selindon, a tiny village with 30 houses. They settled into a hut right in the middle of the jungle. Mostly drug dealers and those avoiding the police, like them, inhabited the area. There was no water, electricity, or food in the hut. At best, they ate only rice and potatoes. Patricia was already 8 months pregnant, but due to severe malnutrition, it seemed like she was only in her 3rd month. The hut was surrounded by huge puddles, and everyone had to constantly wear boots. Fungal infections appeared on everyone's feet, even the children. Their feet were covered in insect bite marks, and their heads had colonies of lice. It was a disgusting place for them and the children, including the unborn ones, because Mai was also pregnant. Mai feared for her children's health. It was very difficult for her in such conditions. Despite her husband's prohibition, she turned on her phone and called her mother, just to hear her voice. The girl didn't even say anything, but it was enough for the police to trace the call. Detectives believed the fugitives were in Lima, but it turned out Stephen had taken them deep into the jungle. The police decided to send 2 officers to the region who knew the case best. They were given 10 days to search. They showed pictures of the group members to everyone passing by, assuming that the girl resembling Patricia would stand out among the other locals. The officers didn't know that she had not only changed her appearance, but also didn't have permission to leave the city. The police decided to go even higher into the mountains. Their persistence paid off. One girl they showed the pictures to recognized Paula. She described her as a strange woman in pink boots who returns home every evening across the bridge with a food package. The officers began to wait at the bridge, and the woman indeed appeared. She moved like a robot, not looking at anyone. The officers followed her. 40 minutes later, they went beyond the city limits and deeper into the forest. Finally, she entered a house where rooms were rented out. The police decided to rent a room in the house because otherwise they couldn't conduct surveillance. They were lucky. They got a room right next to Paula's. They could hear everything happening in the other room. They heard the voices of a man, Paula, and another girl. It turned out to be Mai. But Patricia or the children were not visible. The police did not take more decisive action because Stephen never left the room, not even to use the restroom, and they were not sure if it was him. Naturally, he didn't work. Paula and Mai did while the man lay in bed, and the officers were afraid that he simply wouldn't say where Patricia was. Suddenly, they overheard the man saying that tomorrow they would split up and leave one by one. Stephen planned to go even further to settlements of more wild indigenous tribes. Upon hearing this, the police officers called for backup to capture them. Knowing their schedule, they were able to apprehend group members one by one. Paula was stopped when she left for work early in the morning. Mai also left the house to do laundry. As for Stephen, when the police entered, he was lying on the bed as usual. The man resisted, introduced himself by another name, and pretended not to understand what was happening. To prevent him from stepping barefoot on the floor, pregnant Mai gave him her shoes. After that, he was forcibly removed from the hut. Fortunately, the girls immediately disclosed where Patricia was. By Stephen's command, Patricia and all the children remained in the hut as far away in the jungle as possible when Stephen, Mai, and Paula went to earn money, although Stephen, of course, didn't work. Patricia did everything around the house, took care of the children, and even worked on the plantation near the hut. She was there when the officers arrived. They called her by name. She had become so accustomed to the name Silvana that hearing Patricia felt unfamiliar. The officers believed they were rescuing Patricia and 4 children, but there were already 5. When Stephen, Paula, and Mai left for the city, Patricia begged not to be left alone, but Stephen was adamant, and predictably, at 8.5 months, she began having contractions. She screamed in agony. The children were with her but didn't know how to help her. At the girl's screams, a neighbor came. She was the one who assisted in the delivery. Patricia admits that she never thought she would give birth in the jungle at 19. The girl was extremely thin, looked exhausted when they rescued her, but even then she continued to think only about Stephen and the things he instilled in her. Meanwhile, Stephen was interrogated at the police station. An interesting fact emerged during the investigation. He was left alone with 2 colleagues briefly, and when they returned, one officer had already fallen under his influence. She claimed that Stephen was a prophet and they should help him, not arrest him. Immediately after Patricia, Mai, and Paula were rescued, they were separated as recommended by psychologists. They received assistance as victims of cults, sects, and dependent groups. It took them a long time before they started feeling better. They seemed to be in a lethargic state, but eventually, they woke up. The Aguilar family says that now everything that happened is in the past. They started anew, without accusations, without questions, without doubts. Patricia is still undergoing therapy and lives in her hometown with her parents and daughter. She received education in social rehabilitation and works in an organization that helps people with disabilities. Stephen was sentenced to 20 years in prison for human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation. Many wondered how Patricia's parents didn't notice the changes in their daughter. Patricia was always a good student, but after her beloved uncle left her life, she started failing. Strangely enough, Stephen motivated her to study better, so they noticed changes in their daughter and they liked them. They thought she was coming to her senses. At that time, she was dating a boy from school whom her father didn't like. Alberto was happy when she dumped him. She stopped dressing in black, bought bright clothes, smiled more often, and asked to have a party for her 18th birthday. But her parents couldn't have known that all this was Stephen's demands. There were signs to pay attention to, but you never think that someone from another distant country will infiltrate your home through the internet and take away a family member. Dedication, obedience, detachment from the family happens very slowly, insidiously. It's in the cult's interest for their followers not to have loving and caring people around them. Everyone thinks that nothing like this will ever happen to them, but in moments of weakness, anyone can become vulnerable. Patricia Aguilar experienced firsthand what it's like to be isolated by a cult, taken out of her native country and taken away from her family. With her story, she wants to protect others from falling into the subtle mechanisms used by these false prophets. This case could have gone unnoticed by many, but became known thanks to Patricia's parents, who in their struggle to locate their daughter, managed to grab the attention of the media in different countries and share this story. In 1989, the industrial growth in the American state of Indiana allowed certain businesses to reach unprecedented heights, with businessmen reaping the benefits. John Parker was one of them. John started working at a very young age. As a teenager, he took a job at a restaurant clearing dishes from tables. However, this was not enough for the ambitious young man, and he ventured into selling vacuum cleaners. Going door-to-door selling vacuum cleaners doesn't usually earn much. Even his own family mocked John's choice. The laughter stopped when, just a few months later, the 19-year-old broke all sales records. It seemed like he went from nothing to a super successful person overnight, but that wasn't the case. John worked tirelessly for his goals, putting in 12 to 16 hours a day. Despite his hard work, he wasn't selfish and willingly shared his knowledge and experience to inspire colleagues to excel in their work. Confident and very charismatic, the young man moved to Michigan, where he opened his own vacuum cleaner sales center. The wave of success brought 20-year-old Judy Hicks to his shore. Judy was self-assured and assertive, but she had to be. Unlike John, who grew up in a middle-class family, Judy knew poverty. She married very young and became a mother of 2 children, Christina and Danny. However, her married life didn't work out, and after the divorce, to make ends meet and take care of her children, she also decided to start selling vacuum cleaners. John helped her, first as a colleague, then as a lover. The closer they became, the more successful the business developed. Judy became his right-hand woman. Every time he gave a speech, John started by saying he wouldn't have achieved anything without Judy. The couple married at the end of 1992 and opened a training center for other sales professionals, J&J Parker Industries. By the age of 30, John became a millionaire, and his family grew with 2 more daughters, Tiffany and Erica. Christina and Danny also called John their dad, spent a lot of time at the office with their parents, and it was impossible to tell that John wasn't the biological father of the older children. The family led a deliberately luxurious lifestyle. This was one of John's philosophies, to radiate success so that his employees would also strive for success. He was an idol of the youth of that generation. However, after 10 years of marriage, many things changed. John, once a cheerful and content man, turned into a bundle of nerves. However, not without reason. His wife cheated on him with their colleague. John became suspicious and installed several surveillance cameras at work, which confirmed his wife's affair. It was a severe blow to his ego. He started drinking. Judy begged him to hand over the incriminating video, but John refused. It would give him a significant advantage in divorce proceedings. However, he had no intention of divorcing. As he jokingly told a friend, it's cheaper to keep her, so John decided to take his wife as far away from her lover as possible. The family returned to Indiana and settled in the prestigious neighborhood of Crown Point. John opened an office in Maryland, Indiana, and disbanded the office staff in Michigan. He brought with him only his most loyal employees, including his trusted confidant, Ben. John brought Ben from Michigan and began training him in everything so that when he decided to step back from business, it would continue to thrive. Together, they built a business empire and seemed to be living better than they could have ever imagined. However, on Thursday, April 17, 2003, the emergency services received 2 calls reporting an armed attack in the warehouse district where John Parker's company office was located. The calls came from John's wife, Judy Parker, and his manager, Ben. When the police arrived, they first searched the entire area, including dumpsters and rooftops, in case the suspect was hiding somewhere. Finding no one, they returned to the crime scene and to John Parker, as he turned out to be the victim. His car was parked in front of the office, and he was found lying on the ground with a single bullet hole in the back of his head. The gunshot wound was fatal. A casing from a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol was found nearby the body. What surprised investigators was that a second identical casing was found some distance away from the victim. The man's wallet was missing from his pocket, and at first glance, it appeared to be a botched robbery. While the medical examiner took the body for autopsy, investigators had to find out from Ben and Judy what they had seen. In Judy's account, she behaved unusually calmly, which the detectives attributed to shock. She explained that in the evening, she and her husband had dinner at a local restaurant while their 4 children stayed home watching a movie. One of their younger daughters, Tiffany, had been misbehaving at school, and the couple wanted to discuss discipline for her. The next day was the start of spring break, so it was clear the girl would be spending all her days at home. At some point, their daughter Christina called and said that Tiffany had left her homework in the office, so the couple stopped by to pick it up. While John exchanged a few words with Ben, Judy retrieved their daughter's work and went back to the car. The couple intended to pass some leftover food from the restaurant to Ben. John walked over to the car and opened the rear passenger door behind the driver's seat. Judy saw her husband open the car door, and almost immediately 2 loud bangs rang out. She ducked down, and when she looked up, she saw John fall, and a person dressed all in black quickly running away from the car. It was dark, and she couldn't make out who it was. This story puzzled the detectives. Typically, a robber rarely shoots the victim immediately. Usually, there's a short conversation that escalates before it comes to gunfire, but not this time. They suspected it wasn't a botched robbery. Furthermore, besides the wallet, John was wearing a Rolex watch and other valuable men's jewelry. Judy mentioned that her husband, as a businessman, often had conflicts with other people. He was very demanding of himself and his colleagues. About 3 weeks before the murder, he had a heated argument with a former employee right in the office parking lot. The men exchanged harsh words, and police intervention was required to separate them. Company manager Ben confirmed that such an argument took place. John accused the former employee of not returning all the equipment after his departure. The employee, in turn, believed that he hadn't received all the owed payment. However, everything was resolved. The employee returned the equipment and received the appropriate payment. This turned out to be a dead-end lead that didn't lead anywhere. John was killed on a Thursday evening. However, the previous Monday, a school officer from Crown Point contacted the Maryland police. He learned about the murder from the news and wanted to share important information. For about 6 months, he had known about a conspiracy to murder John Parker involving 3 teenagers. 2 of them were caught with a large sum of cash. The school became suspicious of how 15-year-old students had such a large sum of money, so they questioned them. Although they were interviewed separately, their stories completely matched. They told of their classmate Danny, John Parker's stepson, paying them to kill his stepfather. The seized money was only part of the sum. In reality, they received several $1,000s. However, they deceived Danny, having no intention of even coming close to his stepfather. Since the boys had no intention of committing murder, the school simply confiscated the money and did not pursue the matter further. They didn't even contact Danny's parents or interview him about the incident. Yet, this was an opportunity to learn more about the issues clearly evident in the family. Now, 6 months later, John was dead, murdered, and the police had to determine whether his stepson could be involved. Investigators began interviewing family members, friends, and neighbors of John. The overall impression was that he was an excellent boss and friend, well-liked despite being quite strict and having a volatile temper. John worked very hard but spent every evening with his family. However, it became increasingly difficult for him to keep track of his teenage children, 17-year-old Christina and 15-year-old Danny. Little Christina was simply a wonderful child. But when her mother married John and she was plunged into a world of newfound financial possibilities, all the girl wanted to do was party, enjoy life, and throw parties in their new big house. Soon, she started getting into trouble. Her younger brother Danny wasn't far behind. He was generally more spirited and restless than his sister, and his antics were accordingly mischievous. One evening, without permission and without a driver's license, he took his father's SUV and knocked over mailboxes of neighbors. After that, John had to go around to all of them and negotiate so they wouldn't report his stepson's actions to the police. It's worth noting that John himself grew up in a family with very strict rules and tried to impose similar rules on his family so that the older children wouldn't get into trouble with the law. Of course, the teenagers didn't like this and rebelled. And what about Judy? She preferred to be a friend rather than a mother to Christina and Danny. The parents seemed to be clearly divided into good and bad cops. What was most horrifying was that the younger girls saw the atmosphere in the house unfold and also didn't listen. After learning about the family situation, investigators hurried even more to find the two classmates of Danny and interview him himself. Danny did not deny conflicts with his stepfather, who tried to raise him as best he could. He admitted to giving money to his classmates, but not to kill John, just to scare and beat him up. And he had the money simply because he had been saving it for some time. Danny was still detained, and detectives had to find out if two teenagers accidentally killed John while trying to scare him. It turned out that one of the boys was in prison on the day of the murder, and the other lived in Las Vegas with his grandmother. Detectives went to Vegas and spoke with the teenager. He insisted that Danny had tried to persuade someone to actually kill his stepfather. But he and his friend tricked Danny and took the money without intending to commit murder. Police confirmed that the boy was in Vegas on April 17th, so this turned out to be another dead end. Danny was released home. Meanwhile, John's farewell took place. The man himself liked to repeat that people would forget your name, forget what you said, but they would not forget the feelings you evoked in them. At his funeral, everyone remembered what a wonderful person he was and how positively he influenced those around him. But someone directly stated that the worst part wasn't that John lay in a coffin, but that the person responsible for his death was probably in the same building with them. It was an unpleasant, oppressive feeling shared by everyone. But a week later, the image of the perfect family took another hit when a colleague of John's revealed a new lead, this time involving his stepdaughter, 17-year-old Christina. An employee of J&J Parker Industries disclosed that Christina, who also worked in her parents' company, approached him to find a hitman to kill her stepfather. For her troubles, she gave him $100 and handed over an additional $500 as a down payment for the hitman. Incredibly, this was another plot to kill John, which ended with Christina being deceived once again. However, suspicion now fell not only on Danny, but also on Christina. The girl denied everything, claiming she simply complained to her colleague about her stepfather and he misunderstood her. Without details from Christina regarding the money exchange, investigators again hit a dead end. Was this a coincidence? Or had the teenagers conspired and were hiding a much darker plan? Several weeks later, a month after John Parker's murder, the police stumbled upon another lead leading to Christina's classmates. Under pressure, they confessed to selling a weapon to Christina that was used for shooting practice on a family farm. Officers found a tree with bullet marks on the farm, and on the ground, they discovered casings. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the casings matched those found at the crime scene. Now the police could link Christina to the purchase of the weapon, but the girl simply denied everything. And since the police didn't have the murder weapon in hand, and Christina had an alibi, she was watching a movie at home with her younger sisters. They couldn't prove that she killed John. So who pulled the trigger? The circle narrowed around family members, but for the prosecutor, it wasn't enough. There was only a conspiracy, but no weapon, and no person to pin it on. Meanwhile, without John, his family and business gradually fell apart. Judy spent all her time with her new boyfriend Ben, John's right-hand man. The children were forced to take care of themselves, cooking and cleaning the house. This spoke volumes because after a tragedy, a parent instinctively seeks to spend more time with their children. Judy did just the opposite, indicating she wasn't truly attached to her husband or children. The business also declined, and Judy and the children struggled financially. Judy was supposed to receive $1 million from 2 of John's insurance policies, but because the investigation was ongoing, the insurance company refused to pay her. Judy and Ben moved with the younger girls to Michigan. Danny and his biological father went to Arizona, where the boy found work on a construction site. Christina, expecting her first child, stayed in Indiana with her boyfriend Eric. Only John's close friends and family continued to push for the investigation to continue, which it did without ceasing. In 2007, 4 years after John's murder, a detective from the narcotics department contacted one of the investigators on the case. He informed them that Christina's husband, Eric Grabsky, was involved in a drug-related investigation, and there was already a warrant out for his arrest. Detectives seized the opportunity to glean new information about the old case. They speculated that the hope of a deal with the prosecution would loosen Eric's tongue, and they were not wrong. Eric knew who killed John. The triggerman turned out to be Christina's younger brother, Danny. The question was whether Christina would confirm her husband's words. Eric called her and she agreed to come to the station. She stated that her stepbrother Danny had killed her stepfather. However, initially she tried to downplay her role, minimizing her involvement in the case. But investigators had already determined that she purchased the weapon, and it was she who called her parents about her sister's homework, even though school holidays, including Easter, were starting the next day, so there was no rush to collect Tiffany's homework. Therefore, detectives knew that Christina played an active role in the murder. They pressured her, and she confessed that she knew about all the conspiracies to kill John. She, her brother, and her mother had spent over a year trying to find someone willing to kill John, spending several $1,000s on their search. But after multiple unsuccessful attempts with incompetent contractors, they decided that Danny would do it. Detectives flew to Arizona, where Danny lived and worked. When an investigator approached him and mentioned being from Maryland, Danny visibly softened. The detective asked, "Do you know why I'm here?" To which Danny replied, "I'm ready to tell everything." It was clear that this weighed heavily on him, and he regretted what had happened. Here's what he revealed. The murder of John was Judy's plan. She constantly told the children that she couldn't live with John anymore, that he mistreated her and was abusive. However, when Danny was asked if he ever witnessed such behavior towards his mother, he couldn't recall anything of the sort. Moreover, the police never responded to the family's address. Also, the mother promised the older children that life would be much better without John. They would have money and no control from a strict stepfather who demanded that the children study well and behave properly. Initially, Judy attempted to poison her husband personally, but she failed. Then she and the children began looking for someone willing to carry out this job for money. However, finding a killer and buying a weapon required money. To secretly obtain such large sums from her husband, Judy forged company checks. She stole $7,500 and John was about to find out about it. Ultimately, Judy decided they would do everything themselves. She devised a plan in which all three would have alibis. The mother decided her 15-year-old son, Danny, would commit the murder. Christina's role was to call and lure John to the office. Christina gave Danny the keys to her car, even though he didn't even have a driver's license yet. The accomplices took a huge risk, and at any moment, things could have gone awry. Nevertheless, the teenager climbed out of his bedroom window to avoid being noticed by his younger sisters, got in the car, drove to the office, and waited. He saw the parents arrive, hid behind a dumpster, and waited for an opportunity to shoot. When John approached the car and opened the door, Danny ran up and fired. The gun accidentally fired a second time when he tried to reach for the man's wallet, hence the second shell casing being far from the body. This clarified one of the mysteries that had been troubling the investigators. Danny then fled, got into the car, and quickly returned home, where Christina awaited with a bag into which he placed his clothes, the weapon, and the wallet. He took a shower, and they didn't discuss it further. Christina later handed the bag to her mother, and Judy disposed of it. Following Christina and Danny's confessions, both were arrested. Now the police had to arrest the puppeteer behind her husband's murder, Judy Parker, but the police had absolutely nothing against her. Fortunately, her children agreed to testify against their mother in exchange for reduced sentences. Then Judy decided to confess her guilt in 2009. Christina was sentenced to 5 years in prison for her role in the crime. However, after her release in 2013, she died of a drug overdose at the age of 27. Danny was sentenced to 23 years. He was released 3 years after his sister in 2016. Judy was sentenced to 33 years in prison. She was released in 2023. Judy spent her entire life as a sales agent, and she certainly found a way to sell the idea of murder to her own children. Most likely, she manipulated them for years. and only when they were distanced from her could they clearly see the whole picture. Of course, Judy could have divorced, but she would have received only half of the property and wouldn't have received the $1 million from the insurance. Additionally, John had evidence of marital infidelity. He gave his wife a ticket to a luxurious life, but she no longer wanted to see her husband nearby, yet she wanted to have it all, and anyone standing in her way between the life she had and the life she wanted had to disappear. She forced her teenage children to commit murder, robbing them of their childhood and burdening them with a heavy load, and she shattered the lives of her younger daughters, who now have no father, no older sister, and essentially no mother. On November 6, 1994, Jan Balmain stands on the platform of Newcastle Railway Station, Australia. She cranes her neck, trying to catch sight of the approaching train. Jan eagerly awaits the arrival of her 22-year-old daughter, Ravel, who boarded the train to Sydney. The journey takes just 2 hours. A mother waits, anticipating her daughter, an extraordinarily beautiful blonde with blue eyes, tall and slender, to flutter onto the platform and embrace her. Ravel Balmain lives in the prestigious Sydney suburb of Bellevue Hill, not far from the city center. She is a model and a dancer. She had planned to visit her parents before a work trip to Japan, where her troupe awaited her for their 4th tour. But there is much that Jan doesn't know about her daughter, and on this November day, Ravel does not disembark in Newcastle. Traces of her short life are scattered across Sydney's streets, including items intended to accompany her to Japan, a journey she will never make. 22-year-old Ravel Balmain was close to realizing her dream. As a professional dancer, she had already visited Japan on 3 concert tours and eagerly anticipated her 4th trip. She supplemented her income by modeling, appearing in magazine spreads and product advertisements. Just a few days later, a new issue of a popular Australian magazine featuring Ravel on the cover was scheduled for release, an esteemed accomplishment for a model. Additionally, 4 weeks ago, Ravel met a promising 27-year-old director named Piers Fisher-Pollard. Young, beautiful, and talented, Ravel had high expectations for life, and it seemed like her entire life lay ahead of her. Ravel started dancing at the age of 3. She adored music, jazz, and tap dancing. During her teenage years, she spent a year in a theater school in Britain. However, upon returning from her first concert tour, she realized that performing on stage was her true calling. Unfortunately, it didn't pay as well as she'd hoped, so she juggled dancing with modeling jobs. But even that wasn't enough to cover her bills. Therefore, she decided to improve her financial situation by offering her services to an escort agency. Many girls work in this field for a very short time, facing difficulties, and she was one of them. Much later, Ravel's mother would state that her daughter's decision shocked her family. She had grown up in a loving family, always supportive of their children, and if financial troubles arose, she could have turned to them. The woman speculated that the deeply hidden reason for this decision might have been related to an incident when Ravel was 4 years old and found her 1.5-year-old brother Matthew floating in the pool. He couldn't be saved, and it was very difficult for her parents to recover from this. Perhaps Ravel never managed to overcome it. Nevertheless, in November 1994, Ravel's boyfriend, family, and most of her friends had no idea about her side job. Saturday, November 5th, 1994, was supposed to be her last day working in escort services. At some point, her life took a turn, but after 6 weeks of leading a double life, she was returning to her true love and passion, dance. The day before, she had lunch with her friend Kate Brentnall, who described her as happier than she had ever been. She was very excited about her trip to Japan. Ravel had dyed her hair to a softer, more natural blonde. I thought it was symbolic. I thought she had never looked more beautiful. Sadly, that journey would never take place, because the next evening she disappeared under highly suspicious circumstances. Ravel spent Saturday morning with Piers. In the short time they had been dating, they had become inseparable. However, suddenly Piers developed an intense headache, forcing them to go to the hospital. After seeing the doctor, Ravel suggested having lunch, but Piers declined due to his migraine. Around noon, he escorted her to a bus stop. Ravel headed to the city center while Piers preferred to lie down. At that time, Ravel was working for 2 different escort agencies. One of them was managed by Jane Stanojevic and Zoran Stanojevic. As her boyfriend, Piers, couldn't spend time with her, Ravel called Jane and Zoran's escort agency to inform them that she was available. The administrator replied that she had a 2-hour booking from 4 p.m. It was for a new client, a young man named Gavin Samer, who lived in the eastern suburb of Sydney called Kingsford. Later at 10 p.m., she had another appointment with friends of Zoran from Serbia. Zoran was eager to please his friends and suggested having her accompany them to the hotel because he wanted to offer them the most beautiful girl. Revel arrived at Gavin Sammer's house with a bottle of champagne as requested by Gavin. She was wearing cork wedge shoes, a long skirt, and a tunic. She had a pager. During that time, there were no mobile phones, so escort agencies handed pagers to the girls, sending them messages as new orders came in. At 3:50 p.m., Revel used Gavin's phone to call the administrator and let them know she had arrived. This was a way for the girl to signal that she felt comfortable at the client's house and that everything was fine. 2 hours later at 5:50 p.m., she called the administrator again and said the meeting was over and she was leaving, but there was no need to send a driver for her. However, as Gavin later revealed, she didn't leave, but instead arranged to spend an extra hour with him for additional payment. This was a risky practice because the owners of the escort agencies did not approve and sometimes punished the girls for such side jobs, naturally because they didn't receive their share of the profit. While she was with Gavin, her boyfriend Pierce messaged her, feeling much better. She told him she'd lay down to rest. Pierce easily believed this as he had no suspicion about her side job. At 7 p.m., she received a message on her pager from her friend Kate Brittle. 15 minutes later, Revel called back and let her friend know she couldn't talk, but would call from home in an hour after changing, and then they would have a couple of beers together at the Royal Hotel, a popular pub in Sydney. Afterward, she planned to meet Pierce. The sun set that day at 7:25 p.m. according to Gavin. That was the last time he saw Revel when he dropped her off at the nearest pub, the Tomato Inn. He pulled up to the pub, she got out of the car, said goodbye, and entered through the back door. Gavin then went to a store for cigarettes and cider before heading home, watching TV, and going to bed. At 7:53 p.m., Revel's boyfriend Pierce sent her another message on her pager, but she didn't reply. By this time, Pierce had met their mutual friend Zoe. They were visiting different bars in the city, and Pierce constantly messaged Revel on her pager so she'd know where to find them. The last time he attempted to contact her was at 2:30 a.m. Then he went home to sleep. She didn't respond to any of his messages. On the following day, November 6th, Revel's mother, Jen Belmain, stood on the railway platform in Newcastle, awaiting the arrival of the train from Sydney, on which her daughter was supposed to arrive. Revel's parents were eagerly anticipating their daughter's arrival to have a sort of farewell celebratory dinner, to catch up, chat, share the latest news before she was due to embark on a 2-week rehearsal in Brisbane, followed by her troupe's upcoming 4-month tour in Japan. The train arrived, but Revel wasn't on it. Jen assumed that her daughter might have missed the early morning train and waited for the next one. However, Revel still didn't appear. As time passed, Jen realized that something was amiss. She returned home and immediately made phone calls. She contacted her daughter's friend, the apartment neighbor, and hospitals in Sydney, trying to ascertain her whereabouts. When Revel's apartment neighbor informed Jen that Revel's room still had an almost fully packed suitcase with her belongings, passport, and ticket to Japan, Jen realized it was time to involve the police. Jen, along with Revel's apartment neighbor and her boyfriend Pierce, reported Revel missing. However, the police were not swift in commencing an investigation, despite the discovery of Revel's belongings scattered throughout the Kingsford area, where her last client, Gavin Seymour, resided. Her bag, cosmetics, diary, credit cards, and keys to the Bellevue Hill apartment were found strewn across different streets. One of her high heels was found in a trash bin, while the other was discovered in a nearby block. The plastic casing of her pager was lying in a gutter. On the 5th day after the girl's disappearance, when everything indicated an unfortunate event involving Revel, the police started their investigation. Initially, they explored the version that Revel was abducted on the streets of Kingsford, with the abductor throwing her belongings out of the car window while driving. Wild rumors circulated, suggesting she might have been abducted at the request of an Arabian prince and taken to Saudi Arabia. However, the police attempted to investigate more realistic scenarios. Pierce was the first to be excluded from the list of suspects. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have learned about the girl's double life and became so furious that he killed Revel. However, when informed about her side jobs, it was a double blow for the young man. He had an alibi for the evening of her disappearance, and apart from her family, a few friends, and her roommate, he was one of the few people who insisted on continuing the investigation, demanding a more serious approach to the case. Next in line as a suspect was Gavin. Several suspicious moments arose in his story. He recounted that on that Saturday, when he decided to engage the services of the escort agency, his girlfriend Michelle had left home to visit her family. He hired Revel and paid her $500 for 3 hours. To pay Revel, he pawned Michelle's clarinet and received $250 for it. Additionally, he won $150 at slot machines in the Tomato Inn pub. This summed up to $400. He paid this in cash and another $100 to Revel by check. However, the pub staff couldn't recall cashing out his winnings, and he allegedly lost his family's checkbook. Even in the store where he bought cigarettes and cider, there were no records corresponding to the man's claims. His girlfriend Michelle was, of course, questioned. She flew from Brisbane to Sydney 2 days after Revel's disappearance. Gavin met her at the airport, and she immediately noticed scratches on Gavin's chest and neck. There was also a mark on his finger, as if from a bite. The police also noticed these wounds, but Gavin couldn't explain where they came from, whether from surfing activities or gardening. Michelle also pointed out that Gavin cleaned his car and folded the rear seats, although she added that he often turned the car into a mess, then cleaned it to accommodate his surfboard. Additionally, her incredibly lazy boyfriend laundered the bedding and hung it out to dry just before her arrival. She found it suspicious, but it likely indicated his attempt to hide infidelity rather than criminal activity. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence, the police couldn't even conclusively prove that a crime had occurred. The Revel parents were determined to seek justice for their daughter, but no one was arrested or charged with anything. A member of the Revel family claimed that the police considered Revel's life less valuable because she was promiscuous, hence they half-heartedly conducted the investigation. Gavin's house was searched not immediately after the girl's disappearance, and even then, it was done without a warrant. It was more of a cursory inspection. Gavin's car was checked for DNA and other evidence only after 10 days. Many crucial witnesses were not interviewed and evidence was not gathered. Naturally, the investigation stalled, and there were no developments in it for several years. Only in 1999, after an active campaign by the public, media, and the girl's relatives, did interest in the case resurface, and it was reviewed by the coroner. The detective who led the initial investigation told the coroner that, in the police's opinion, Gavin was the prime suspect in the case. Even Gavin's lawyer, Seymour, was forced to agree that his client was the sole suspect. Gavin worked for the girl's parents' company and at the time was an attractive, successful young man. Additionally, he was quite athletic as he loved surfing. Gavin lived with his girlfriend, Michelle, but when she went to visit her family, he decided to hire an escort. Gavin was the last person seen with Revel. According to him, she spent an additional hour with him before he dropped her off at the Red Tomato Inn, a pub in Kingsford. He parked his car in the back. Revel exited the car, said goodbye, and walked inside through the back door. He then went to a store and headed home. However, nobody at the pub who was present at that time could recall seeing Revel. The owner explicitly stated that they had a different crowd that evening, and if such a girl had entered the pub, everyone would have noticed. Despite Gavin purchasing cider at the store, no one remembered this. In other words, after Revel's last call to her friend from Gavin's house at 7:15 p.m., nothing from Gavin's account was officially confirmed. Moreover, Michelle, now his ex-girlfriend, told the coroner in 1999 that she called Gavin that evening but got no answer. After several attempts, she finally got through at 9:22 p.m. and he sounded agitated. His other ex-girlfriend, who had been involved with him before, stated that after drinking, he could become aggressive and hit her in the face. This raised suspicions further, especially because Gavin had been drinking on Saturday throughout the day and had at least consumed half a bottle of champagne brought by Revel. However, one witness, a young man named Jeremy Coughlin, offered a completely different scenario of what might have happened to Revel. Jeremy was a friend of one of Revel's wealthiest clients, Mark Colton. Jeremy recounted that he and Mark were at a party when, after a few drinks, Mark abruptly said, "Aren't people stupid? Have you heard about Revel Belmain? First, there were rumors about an Arab prince who took her to Saudi Arabia. Nonsense. She's at a depth of 3 meters and nobody will find her body. That's what you get for deceiving the brothel you work for. The brothel owner wanted her dead because she was damaging his business." Jeremy asked his friend about Mark's relationship with Revel, and he replied that he met her outside the brothel, paying her between $500 to $1,000 a week, which was cheaper than paying the agency $200 per hour. When Mark Colton was questioned, he denied saying anything like that. But he indeed had heard rumors that agencies were threatening employees who saw clients privately. Owners of the agency were also questioned. It turned out that on Revel's last day working at the escort agency, she owed Jane and Zoran money, around $300. However, as explained by Jane, this wasn't considered unusual. While most clients pay with credit cards, some prefer cash, and at the end of each week, the girls in the agency reconcile who owes what to whom. According to Jane, Revel was planning to repay the money owing to a meeting with Zoran's friends scheduled for 10 p.m. However, Zoran claimed he was unaware of such an agreement. In fact, his words contradicted those of his wife on almost every point. Jane described that on the day the girl disappeared, she and Zoran bought a television, had pizza at a pizzeria around 5 p.m., and went home. She didn't work that night because she was heavily pregnant and tired. However, Zoran told the police he didn't work on the evening of the girl's disappearance, literally saying, "No, not on Saturday." He claimed he took the TV to the office, installed it, and returned home around 7 p.m. Yet, 4 years later, during the coroner's inquest, he stated that by saying, "No, not on Saturday," he meant not during the day on Saturday. In reality, he did work that evening and returned home around 2 a.m. He blamed the misunderstanding on the translator. However, later, a linguistic expert confirmed that the original statements of the man were translated correctly. Regardless, Zoran claimed he did not see Revel that night. As the agency's driver, he picked up another girl, Kelly, at 7:15 p.m. He took her to meet his friends at Royal Hotel Park in Darling Harbor, where he waited for 2 hours before driving her to another appointment at the Sheraton Airport Hotel. When he was taking the girl home, he had a flat tire, which he had to fix himself. For 4 years following the girl's disappearance and before the case was considered by the coroner, the police did not interview either Zoran's Serbian friends, who had long since left for Belgrade, or Kelly, Revel's colleague, who provided Zoran's alibi. Partly this was because when Jane Stanojevic gave her initial statement in 1994, she said that Revel was supposed to meet the Serbians at the Swiss Grand Hotel in Bondi. After 4 years, she claimed she had made a mistake and actually meant the Park Royal Hotel in Darling Harbor. It wasn't until 1999 that the police checked the registration records of both hotels, finding no information about the Serbians in either. Only after Zoran's testimony did the police locate Kelly, who reluctantly corroborated his words. However, when the police checked the Sheraton Hotel records, they couldn't find evidence of Kelly or her client being there. Gavin Seymour, the lawyer, was puzzled as to why the girl was miraculously found only now, why she wasn't questioned 4 years ago, and why the police didn't investigate inconsistencies between Zoran's and his wife's statements, which couldn't even agree on whether he was working on November 5th, 1994. In response to all these questions, the chief investigator who led the initial investigation said that he didn't know. The Revel family was deeply upset by what they heard during the coroner's inquest. The police failed to interview many crucial witnesses, and other witnesses, of course, had long forgotten what they had seen over such a period of time. Their lawyers stated that the girl's parents were treated as a nuisance, despite their only desire being to know what happened to their daughter. Didn't they deserve that? Even the coroner was forced to agree that the initial investigation wasn't as thorough as it should have been. After examining the case, the coroner dismissed the theory that Revel staged her own disappearance because there was no evidence to support it. After all, if she wanted to disappear, the timing was extremely inconvenient. She was already planning an extended trip to Japan and would have returned to pursue her career as a model and dancer with renewed vigor, making her short stint as a call girl forgettable. Additionally, her personal life seemed perfect. She and Piers were crazy about each other, and there was nothing indicating that she wanted to run away. On May 28, 1999, the coroner ruled that Revel was murdered on November 5, 1994, by an unknown person or persons. He noted that there wasn't sufficient evidence against the police's main suspect, Gavin Seymour. However, if his name had been hidden from the public eye until then, now everyone knew who was considered the prime suspect in the case. Before the coroner ruled that Revel was murdered, the police had no body or evidence to work with. It was only in 2008 that detectives from the cold case unit sent forensic experts to Gavin's house, due to advancements in technology. Subsequently, detectives went to Tasmania to question Gavin, but he refused to provide DNA. Gavin, once a successful young man, moved to Tasmania and worked as a chef due to being essentially accused without trial of Revel's murder. He led a very secluded life, drank heavily, and hardly interacted with locals. After spending 15 years there, he returned to Sydney in 2018. He only spoke to a journalist once, explaining that the case had cost him job opportunities and felt as though he was punished without being proven guilty. He knew people considered him guilty, but he claimed innocence. In reality, he was more preoccupied with how the case affected him than Revel and her loved ones. However, he stated he didn't kill Revel. He was only guilty of hiring a call girl that day. Revel's parents passed away without receiving answers about their daughter. What happened to her? Who killed her and why? Her sister still hopes the case will progress. Over the years, she searched for her sister's body. Now, she seeks answers. She needs to know who killed Revel. It seems her prayers were answered because in 2021, a new phase of the investigation began. The police announced a reward of $1 million for information leading to Revel's killer's arrest. Additionally, Jane King, former owner of the escort agency and Zoran's ex-wife, made an incredible statement. She said she never thought Gavin Seymour could be involved in Revel's disappearance. However, she now had new evidence supporting Gavin's truth, evidence that would help clear his name but was not found by the police conducting the initial investigation. Essentially, his whereabouts that evening were confirmed. That's all she could disclose at the moment. This new information turned the investigation upside down. In fact, a series of new facts were discovered in the case, crucial enough to be presented to the coroner in February next year. Yes, it took almost 30 years, but the police identified clear contradictions that shifted the entire focus of the investigation. While old evidence still needs testing with new technologies, the new investigation is focused on Jane's ex-husband Zoran and his constantly changing story. He was one of the main drivers for the company, transporting girls to clients. However, there were always discrepancies in the statements he gave to the police. During the initial interrogation, 10 days after Revel's disappearance, he claimed he wasn't working that night, but was at home with his wife. In 1999, he admitted to being at work, but his new version of events still didn't align because the evidence crucial to his alibi was not found. Revel was supposed to meet Zoran's Serbian friends at 10 p.m., but for some reason, the police never questioned them. Incredibly, in 2021, an anonymous call was made to an organization called Crime Stoppers regarding this man, in the photo, who could be involved in the crime. This likely refers to Bojan Prevalovic, Zoran's friend and Revel's last presumed client. While Jane King never met her husband's friend, she now knows that Zoran arranged something for him the day after the girl's disappearance. He bought a ticket from Australia to Thailand. Essentially, the man Revel was supposed to meet that evening left the country the very next day after her disappearance, and no one bothered to inquire about the reason for such haste or coincidence. In December 2021, a raid was conducted on Zoran's property, revealing cannabis worth $400,000 and exclusive items valued at $150,000. He faced 36 charges and was denied bail. Most importantly, according to the police, the raids were carried out based on information obtained during the new investigation into Revel Belmain's disappearance and presumed murder. A detective explicitly stated they were investigating Zoran's involvement in the crime. However, if Zoran's behavior appears unusual, no less suspicious are the actions of Jane King herself. On the day Revel disappeared, she and Zoran had lunch at a pizza place. The next morning, upon learning that Revel wasn't answering calls or messages, Jane immediately dialed the pizza place's number. A staff member recalls her being in a panic, as if it were crucial for her to secure an alibi. She allegedly said to the staff member, "The police are investigating a murder. Can you confirm that we were at your restaurant?" Jane denies phrasing it this way. She insists she said disappearance. But regardless of whether she said murder or disappearance, why was she in such a hurry to confirm her alibi on the very day Revel, a grown 22-year-old woman, had disappeared just a few hours ago? Where did this rush come from? Why was she so certain that Revel simply missed her last evening order, given that such occurrences had been noted before? Jane King herself hadn't even called the police at that point. Likely, nobody had yet contacted the police, and certainly nobody was conducting an investigation. It seems she was certain that she would be asked where she was that day. One can't help but suspect that Jane and Zoran know more than they want to reveal. At the very least, people who definitely knew where Revel was that evening, apart from her last client, were the escort agency administrator, Jane King, and Zoran Stanovich. The new police investigation leading to the second coroner's inquest, planned for early next year, is in defiance of the apparent difficulties posed by the time elapsed since Revel Belmane's disappearance. However, it currently promises the greatest hope that this dreadful case will be solved. Today, detectives are closer than ever to capturing her killer. The criminal world of Liverpool was seriously shaken. 3 guys broke into a father and son's house and made off with a 30-kilogram stash of prohibited substances. The robbery sent shockwaves through the city's underworld. The gang that owned the stolen batch was once considered untouchable. A secret informant reported that the guys who lost goods worth £1 million were at the top of the city's criminal hierarchy. No one could believe that someone would dare to steal from them. Police managed to crack the case by gaining access to their phones, and in May 2022, some of them found themselves behind bars. However, Liverpool's gangs were still furious and tried to get to anyone they believed was involved in the heist. Rumors circulated that 35-year-old Joseph Nee had been gathering information for them. Joseph Nee had only recently been released from prison, where he served time for drug distribution and robbery. He was granted early release and was required to comply with parole conditions. Nee was part of a gang that trafficked Class A controlled substances into Liverpool, the most dangerous of them all. Joseph wasn't considered the most popular guy even within his criminal circle, and some had even targeted him before because even his own associates viewed him as an informant and a snitch. On August 22, 2022, Joseph and his friends gathered at a mutual acquaintance's house to watch a football match between Liverpool and United. The game ended at 21:52, and shortly after, Joseph left the house with one of his friends, Paul Abraham. Later, Paul would recount that they were simply walking down the street when, at 21:59, they heard 3 loud pops. Of course, they had heard such sounds before and instantly recognized them as gunshots. The men started running. The shooter circled around and began firing at the men from behind at close range. The attacker was very close to his target and, of course, knew how to handle a firearm. As a result, the bullet struck Joseph in the upper abdomen, and he fell immediately. Paul Abraham leaped over his fallen wounded friend and sprinted towards the park gates. It might not have been the noblest behavior towards a friend, but perhaps he knew that it wasn't worth risking his life for Joseph. At that moment, the armed man was in a perfect position, unlike his victim. Joseph lay unarmed, wounded, and defenseless on the ground, while the stranger, dressed in black and wearing a balaclava, confidently approached him, holding a 9mm pistol. Joseph begged for mercy, but the stranger paid no attention to his pleas and coldly squeezed the trigger. The shot could only have been lethal, but obviously the universe was on Joseph's side at that moment. As they say, the gun jammed and it didn't fire. Joseph didn't miss this chance to jump up and, despite his wound, run away. Surprisingly, the shooter was prepared for any turn of events. He calmly retrieved 2 weapons, a revolver, and continued the pursuit, never ceasing to fire. Meanwhile, Joseph was running in the direction of King's Hit Avenue, an ordinary street where ordinary families lived. This was the home of 46-year-old Cheryl Corbell and her 3 children, Chloe, Ryan, and their younger sister, 9-year-old Olivia, who everyone called Liv. Of course, all the residents on the street who were at home heard that there was some commotion outside. Some realized that these were gunshots, while others were puzzled about what was happening. Among them was Cheryl. The woman opened the door and looked out onto the street, as many would have done in her place. However, Joseph noticed the light in the partially open door, and he ran as fast as he could toward Cheryl's house. The woman was horrified to see an injured man approaching her, followed by an armed man in a mask. Quickly assessing the situation and realizing that it was not worth getting involved in the gang's altercation, she rushed back into the house and tried to slam the door. Unfortunately, the dropped latch prevented her from doing so. Joseph, desperate to escape and knowing that his time was running out because his pursuer was about to catch up with him, pounded on the door, begging the homeowner for help. Cheryl had already realized that these were some criminal gang troubles, and being a Liverpool resident, she understood that she and her family would face trouble if she got involved in something like this. So, she ordered the man to leave. She must have felt sorry for the wounded man, but her desire to protect her own children outweighed everything else. However, Joseph had no intention of leaving. He threw himself against the door with all his weight, breaking inside, knowing that this would bring enormous problems to the family. The man burst inside and collapsed on the floor, weakened from the chase and the gunshot wound. But the pursuer didn't back down. He saw Joseph Nee enter the house. Another person might have thought that there would always be another day, another opportunity to reach the target. But the shooter had no intention of giving up. He had a mission to accomplish, regardless of who he harmed. The commotion near the front door of the house, which had now shifted into the hallway, was accompanied by noise. Chloe, Ryan, and Olivia were sleeping, but they woke up due to the loud sounds. Ryan recalls that he was in his room when he heard 3 loud noises followed by quick footsteps. It was his younger sister, Olivia, running downstairs crying out, "Mom, I'm scared!" Ryan also came out of his room but stayed at the top of the stairs, watching in bewilderment as chaos unfolded below. He looked down and wondered who this man lying in the hallway was. He saw his mother trying to close the door, and his younger sister stood just a few steps away from the front door. Olivia wanted to be closer to her mother. She went down to her, crying, "Mom, I'm scared! Mom, I'm scared!" The assailant at this moment could not ignore the child's cries. He knew that Joseph Nee had burst into the home of an ordinary family with no connection to their disputes. He saw Cheryl trying to eject the stranger from the house, saw Joseph attempting to get inside, and heard Olivia's cries. However, none of this mattered to him because he simply started shooting through the gap in the door without thinking about where the bullets might hit. A bullet struck Cheryl, entering her right hand. But even though she was in pain, she continued to battle with the door. Joseph, at this moment, regained his senses to the point where he began to help her. He shouted at her to call the police because the shooter was still trying to force his way in. The shooter managed to push his hand with the revolver through the gap in the door. While Joseph began to plead with him to stop again, Cheryl jammed the door, including his hand with the weapon, before he began shooting once more. A bullet hit the door frame. Finally, the shooter decided he had spent too much time and retreated. Cheryl was able to breathe a sigh of relief, stopped struggling with the door, and rushed to comfort her daughter. She wasn't concerned about her own wound. The most important thing was to hug Olivia and tell her that everything would be okay, that no one would harm her now. Cheryl noticed that there was a lot of blood on Olivia's pajamas and thought that her wound on her arm was bleeding heavily. But then she lifted her daughter's shirt and realized that it wasn't her blood. Olivia had been shot. The same bullet that had injured Cheryl had gone through her right hand and into Olivia's chest. Olivia was gasping for air. Her mother knelt beside her, begging her daughter to stay with her. Ryan, who still hadn't realized that his sister was wounded, began shouting at Joseph to get out, but the uninvited guest had no intention of staying. Joseph managed to make a call and was picked up by his 2 friends in an SUV. They rushed him to the hospital, not giving a second thought to the condition they left the family members in, whose lives had just been forever changed. They simply abandoned them amidst all the chaos. While Cheryl called for help, she held Olivia in her arms and instructed her son to continuously apply pressure to the wound on Olivia's chest. Only then did the boy realize that his sister was injured. Olivia's lips had turned blue, and the bleeding had stopped. Ryan assisted his mother in carrying Olivia upstairs. They tried to stop the bleeding with towels. A neighbor arrived, attempting to offer some assistance. Cheryl desperately tried to keep Olivia conscious. Later, she would tell the police that at some point, Olivia's body went limp and her eyes rolled upwards. It was at that moment that Cheryl realized Olivia had passed away. The police arrived at 10:10 p.m. An officer felt Olivia's faint heartbeat, and they carried her out of the house, rushing her to the nearest children's hospital in an ambulance. They held on to hope, but the doctors were unable to do anything. Olivia was pronounced dead at 11:24 p.m. Cheryl wasn't by her side when she passed, as she was receiving medical attention herself. Just a few hours earlier, it had been a normal, happy family, and now a mother and son were left as witnesses to the death of their 9-year-old daughter and sister. Meanwhile, a man named Thomas Cashman, known as Tommy, dressed in black but without the balaclava, rushed to the home of his former lover with whom he had a very brief affair. He entered her house without permission, scaring her terribly as he entered her bedroom. He was agitated and claimed that someone had tried to kill him, and he wanted to kill that person in return. In other words, he needed her help, and he was willing to say anything to get it. He even stated that she was the only one he could trust, despite having a fiancée with whom he had spent many years. The woman believed Tommy and offered him shelter for the night. However, the next morning, when all the media were buzzing about the shocking crime, she realized that Tommy had been involved in the shootout and was responsible for the death of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Korbel. Now, involuntarily, she became an accomplice. The woman was horrified by this prospect. On one hand, she didn't want to cover up a child killer, but on the other hand, any Liverpool resident knows how dangerous it can be to cross paths with criminal gangs. Uncertain about what to do, she called her boyfriend, Paul Russell. Paul arrived and had a private conversation with Tommy. Tommy immediately confessed to Paul that he had been hunting Joseph, but was abruptly cut off by Joseph, who asked him not to say anything about it to avoid implicating him in the crime. It was a very reasonable move on Joseph's part. What remains unclear is why he later made a significant mistake, giving Tommy different clothes, helping him get rid of the items he was wearing, and taking him to where his car was parked. Perhaps Paul understood that Tommy could pose a threat to him or his girlfriend and chose to assist him. But this act of help to a killer will likely have serious consequences for Paul as well. During this period, the investigation into the murder was in progress. Joseph Nee, who had suffered injuries, much like Cheryl and Olivia, declined to cooperate with the police. His primary concern was self-preservation, as the looming threat of returning to prison for violating his parole weighed heavily on him. Despite being involved in the criminal underworld, Joseph should have been able to surmise the identity of his assailant and whose orders the killer was following. Nevertheless, he informed the officers that anyone could have taken a shot at him that night. It's noteworthy that Joseph was not the only one apprehensive about engaging with law enforcement. Olivia had become the third Liverpool resident to succumb to gunshot wounds within a week, not to mention the numerous incidents where victims were shot but survived. In a city aptly nicknamed the British Amsterdam, crossing paths with criminal gangs was indeed perilous. A reward for information on Olivia's assailant had been announced, which quickly swelled to a record-high amount of £200,000, thanks to an anonymous contributor who added £100,000 to the fund. However, despite this substantial incentive, no one came forward with information. Nonetheless, the police succeeded in identifying a suspect, 34-year-old Thomas Cashman. He was a father of two, aged 4 and 14, engaged to a girl he had been dating since their school days. The family resided in a spacious suburban house in West Derby. Tommy had previously worked at a car wash, but his current lifestyle was vastly different. Officially unemployed, he rented a house that, in reality, belonged to the gang's leader. It was evident that his involvement in criminal activities afforded him a lavish life. Fortunately, Liverpool boasted extensive CCTV coverage, making it challenging to perpetrate an attack without being captured on camera. Investigation revealed that at 8:30 p.m., Tommy returned home, swiftly changed into black attire, and left his residence. He didn't make much effort to conceal himself while hunting his target. Surveillance footage documented him passing the house on Finch Lane several times before traversing past it once more. Tommy was convinced that his target was inside that house, having closely monitored his movements. He had even attempted to attack him earlier that day, though that endeavor had failed. When Joseph finally left the house, Tommy was resolute in his intent to eliminate him. However, fate took a different course, and an innocent bystander fell victim to a stray bullet. Such are the consequences when the worlds of ordinary individuals and criminals collide. Tommy's trousers, which he had provided to Paul Russell, were discovered at his sister's residence bearing his DNA. Gunpowder residue was also found on his right leg. Video evidence, DNA profiling, and gunpowder residue collectively linked him to the attack on Joseph. Yet the investigation had another valuable asset: a courageous witness who risked his life to oppose Liverpool's criminal underworld. In the early hours of September 4th, 2022, Tommy was apprehended while hiding at a friend's apartment. In October 2022, Tommy was formally charged with Olivia's murder, the attempted murder of Joseph and Cheryl, as well as possession of a firearm. Paul Russell faced charges of aiding and abetting, despite his earnest efforts to distance himself from the case. The trial of Tommy took place in Manchester in March 2023. Tommy denied all allegations. He claimed he hadn't killed anyone and that he appeared on the video because he was a local drug dealer, making deliveries that day and buying toys for his sick child. He added that he had no intention of killing anyone that day and that he had been friends with Joseph Nee for the past 10 years. However, his words were completely contradicted by a key prosecution witness. The remarkable effect came when Tommy's former girlfriend, who had sheltered him immediately after the crime, appeared in court. It was an incredibly brave move on her part, considering she lived in a city where many of Tommy's friends and gang members resided. Naturally, she would be protected under a witness protection program. As the police stated, she received more threats of violence than any other witness in Merseyside police history. She had to completely abandon her previous life, yet she chose to do the right thing. The witness explained her decision by saying that one should not be afraid to come forward when it involves the murder of a 9-year-old Olivia. The witness described how the accused came to her after the murder, trying to secure her support to create a false alibi. It's unclear why he couldn't ask his own fiancée for this favor. Tommy's defense team attempted to twist her words, suggesting that she wanted to frame her former lover because he refused to leave his fiancée for her. It was an absurd attempt to discredit the witness, and despite their efforts, she remained highly convincing. Following the witness's example, other people also found the courage to approach the police. They revealed that within criminal circles, Tommy was known as a contract killer or a hitman. He had been hired for various murders and was suspected in other homicide cases and assassination attempts, including another attempt on Joseph Nee's life with the same weapon used to kill Olivia on that fateful day. In fact, the same weapon had been used on January 27, 2020, when a 19-year-old was shot. It was evident that Tommy had hired a criminal cartel to assassinate Joseph Nee. On March 30th, after 3.5 weeks of court proceedings, the jury unanimously found Thomas Cashman guilty on all counts. The sentencing was scheduled for April 3rd. On the same day, Olivia's family intended to address the court, speaking to the murderer and recounting how the crime he committed had affected their entire family. However, Tommy refused to even appear in court on that day. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole at a minimum of 42 years, making him 76 years old upon potential release. The judge commented on her decision, explaining that she would have preferred to sentence him to life without parole. However, she had to acknowledge the fact that Tommy didn't intend to kill Olivia. If he had intended to kill a child, he would have received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It was evident to everyone in court that his target was another criminal. The judge took into consideration that he was also a father and wouldn't be able to see his children as often as he would have liked, but that was solely his own fault. She emphasized that the man's refusal to appear in court was not taken into account. Paul Russell was also found guilty of aiding and abetting and is currently in prison awaiting his sentence. Olivia's mother, Cheryl, had hoped to look the killer in the eyes and express her thoughts about him. However, he deprived her of this opportunity by not appearing in court. Cheryl admits that she didn't know he could simply choose not to come. Therefore, Olivia's family, particularly Cheryl and Olivia's Aunt Antonia, are advocating for changes in the law to require criminals to appear in court during sentencing and meet face-to-face with the victims' families. Since Olivia's murder, not much time has passed, and her mother admits that during these few months, she has been driven to madness by the deafening silence in their home. Olivia, from her childhood, was a chatterbox and giggler. If Olivia had survived in just 5 days, she would have performed a truly noble act. She intended to donate her hair to a charitable organization. She was eager to help an organization that makes wigs for sick children and had decided to cut off a whole 12 inches of her locks. People would have understood what a tremendous gesture it was coming from a 9-year-old girl. Giving a piece of herself to another child who needed it more would have shown just how wonderful Olivia was. The complete opposite of the people who invaded her home that August night in 2022 when Olivia took a bullet meant for a criminal. In memory of Olivia, other children created a beautiful corner in the park where she loved to play. They painted an enormous butterfly on the wall and planted flowers of a beautiful pink color. During Olivia's farewell at the church, hundreds of people gathered. Everything was adorned with pink butterflies. Olivia's mother, Cheryl, bid a moving farewell to her daughter, saying that Liv was loved and adored by everyone who knew her. She will never be forgotten. Cheryl added, "I won't say goodbye, but I'll say goodnight. I love you. We'll see you in the morning." Jose was not an ordinary guy, quite the opposite. He felt that he could get anything he wanted from life. Not because he was capable or deserving of it, but simply because he desired it so much. He didn't like blending in with the crowd. He wanted to stand out, to make people tremble with fear of the sight of him. Jose was tough, just like his friends. They always had each other's backs, did everything together, and on that night when Jose saw a ring with the letter E engraved on it, he knew he had to have it because his girlfriend's name was Esther. He thought it would be a perfect romantic gesture. So he leaned over and took the ring off the lifeless girl's hand, a girl he and his friends had just killed. Jennifer Lee Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Christine Pena, who was 16, were best friends. Despite Jennifer being younger, she was obedient and well-mannered, and her positive influence had a wonderful impact on her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth's parents were delighted that their daughter had such a reliable, faithful, and fantastic friend. The two girls shared an interest in makeup and fashion. They enjoyed dressing uniquely, skillfully applying makeup, and choosing accessories. They attended the same school in Houston, Texas, and were currently on summer vacation. Thursday, June 24, 1993 came around. A friend invited Elizabeth and Jennifer to a poolside party. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's house, where at 8 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Melissa, drove the girls to their friend Gina's house, who was hosting the party. The girls were excited and thrilled, enjoying the pleasant warm summer evening in the company of friends. Time flew by unnoticed, and the hour when their parents would expect them to be home was approaching. In principle, the parents weren't afraid to let the girls go out in the evening. They had cash with them just in case. Jennifer carried a pager and always kept $10 for a taxi in her pocket. And if they wanted their parents to pick them up, they only needed to find a telephone or a payphone and call. But this time, the girls decided to walk home. As they said their goodbyes to all their friends, the clock struck 10:45 and they were feeling the pressure of time. The girls had two options for walking home on foot. They could have taken the usual route by walking along the boulevard and turning onto the street leading to Elizabeth's house. This path would have taken them about half an hour. On the other hand, the park offered the possibility of saving 10 to 15 minutes. Despite their concerns about being late, they decided to go through the park. The route involved walking through the park, crossing a railway bridge, following a path, and eventually arriving at Elizabeth's house. Of course, at night, this route was dark and secluded, a place that teenage girls should avoid. However, many teenagers in the city casually used this shortcut. On the same night, Sandra Ertman woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that the light in Jennifer's room was still on, which was unusual. Usually, when Jennifer came home, she would always turn off the light to let her parents know she had safely arrived and was going to sleep. Sandra assumed that Jennifer had stayed overnight at her friend Elizabeth's house without informing them. When her husband woke up a little later, he asked Sandra if their daughter had spent the night at Elizabeth's or Gina's house. Sandra replied that she wasn't sure. She wanted to cover for their daughter to avoid her father scolding her, but by 11 a.m., Sandra and Randy started calling Gina's and Elizabeth's families. The Pena family didn't answer the calls, presumably because they were at work. Around 1 p.m., Randy went to talk to Gina. She mentioned that she last saw the girls at 10:45 p.m. the previous night when they were heading to Elizabeth's house. Gina suggested that Randy should go together with her to the Pena family home. They did just that. Randy Ertman and Gina knocked on the door and even the windows of the house, calling out for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but received no response. Randy took Gina back home and returned to the Pena family's house. It was then that he finally met Adolfo and Melissa Pena. The parents of Elizabeth revealed that they hadn't seen the girls since the previous evening and assumed that their daughter was just sleeping in on her summer vacation, so they hadn't checked her room in the morning. They called the police, but initially, the authorities didn't take the disappearance of the girls seriously. In response, the families took matters into their own hands, printed flyers, went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen their daughters, but no one had any information. Adolfo came up with an idea to walk through the park since he knew about the short path to his house. He walked across the railway bridge and the path where the girls might have walked. Something urged him to check near the tree line, but fortunately, he didn't give in to that intuition. 4 days of uncertainty passed when a call came into the Crime Stoppers hotline. An anonymous caller reported that the girls were in the park. Officers immediately began the search. At the edge of the wooded area, an officer noticed something resembling an item of women's clothing. As he approached, he realized it was not just clothing but the bodies of the girls. The victims were lying on their backs just a few meters apart, naked, and their bodies had already greatly decomposed due to the summer heat. Insects were present, making it even more difficult for even experienced police officers to look at the bodies. Initially, they wanted to keep the horrifying find hidden from reporters and the public, but the news spread rapidly. Randy Ertman was speaking with journalists about his daughter's disappearance when a reporter informed him over the radio that the bodies had been found in the park. Randy persuaded the reporters to take him to the park. Police officers had to restrain him as he attempted to break through the police tape, shouting, "She has light hair. Tell me one of them has light hair." He only stepped back when a detective told him that he couldn't provide any information yet and needed Jennifer's dental records. It was then that Randy understood the officers were trying to shield him from the sight of the bodies, an image he would never be able to forget. Dental records confirmed that the bodies found in the park belonged to 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena. The cause of death was strangulation. Several shoe prints were discovered around the bodies, indicating that there were multiple perpetrators involved. Now, when the girls were found, the police were determined to find those responsible for their deaths. Although it was assumed that the call to Crime Stoppers could be entirely anonymous, the police traced it back. The call led them to the home of the Kent family. The homeowner, Joe Kent, admitted to making the call. He listed several names and claimed that these individuals were the ones who killed the girls. Among them was his own brother, Peter Kent. The police searched Peter's room and found jewelry belonging to the girls, which confirmed Joe's statement. But what exactly happened that night? So, Jennifer and Elizabeth decided to take a shortcut through the park because they had promised their parents to return before the designated time. It was around 11 o'clock, and the park was not a particularly safe place for two young girls at that time. Nevertheless, they walked through the park and encountered two young men. The guys' names were Frank and Roman Sandoval. They didn't say anything to the girls, didn't attempt to harass, shout, or whistle at them. They simply passed by. It would have been wonderful if they had told Jennifer and Elizabeth about the gang meeting taking place in the park and advised them to turn around and go in a different direction. That would have saved them. However, the brothers just walked past. Soon after, they heard a woman's scream. Did they realize what was happening? Yes, of course, they did. But they didn't do anything. They just left. The twin brothers, Frank and Roman, had just attended a ceremony for initiating a new gang member, which was held in the park. 6 young people aged between 14 and 18 took part in the ceremony. Essentially, they were all teenagers. The participants included 18-year-olds Jose Medine, Derek Sean O'Brien, and Peter Kentua, as well as 17-year-old Efren Perez and 14-year-old Venancio Medine, the younger brother of Jose. The new 17-year-old gang member whose initiation was taking place was named Raul Villarreal. So, besides the Sandoval brothers, the 6 teenagers gathered in the park to initiate the new gang member. The initiation was quite peculiar. Raul had to fight with each of the guys for 5 minutes. He didn't succeed entirely, but they accepted him nonetheless. After the formal part, if you can call it that, the guys stayed in the park, drinking and chatting. Suddenly, Frank Sandoval had an uneasy feeling and insisted that he and his brother leave. Following the twins, 18-year-old Jose Medine and his 14-year-old brother were about to leave when suddenly Jose noticed Elizabeth. He attempted to grab her chest, but she pushed his hand away and wanted to continue walking. However, this was not part of Jose's plans. He said, "No, little girl, where do you think you're going?" and put his hand around her neck, dragging her down the small slope. Jennifer was walking slightly ahead and had already passed the spot where the gang's initiation was taking place. She had every chance to escape and save herself, but upon hearing Elizabeth's cries, she rushed to help her. Not many would have intervened in such a situation, but Jennifer acted exactly like that. She saw only Jose and thought that she and Elizabeth could handle one guy together, giving her a real chance to save her friend. She probably didn't suspect that there were 5 more teenagers down the slope. So when Jennifer rushed back to Elizabeth, other members of the gang grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. The guys forced the girls to take off their clothes and underwear, and for the next hour 5 guys in turn, and sometimes at the same time, mocked Jennifer and Elizabeth. 14-year-old Venancio Medai and watched in amazement. Later, he will tell how the girls fought off their attackers. Jennifer bit the assailants, while Elizabeth kicked the air and screamed. They were, of course, weaker than the 6 teenagers, the boys, but they still did everything they could to escape. During the attack, the victims often looked at each other, which made them cry even harder. At first, Elizabeth didn't cry, she was more in anger. However, seeing what the boys were doing to Jennifer, tears started streaming down her cheeks as well. The boys approvingly patted each other on the back when they switched places and crudely insulted the girls. Even Jose dared to ask Elizabeth for her name and phone number while mocking her. 14-year-old Venancio Medina watched the attack in horror. When he asked to hang out with his older brother, he probably didn't expect anything like this. He also didn't want to participate in the relentless abuse, but he feared the other boys. So, after their instructions, he also mistreated Jennifer. It is reported that he was the only one who asked his brother and Peter Kent to release the girls, but Peter whispered to him that they saw their faces and could identify them. The leader of the group, 18-year-old Peter Kent, declared that they must not allow the victims to be identified later. The newcomer, Raoul, yelled at Jennifer, ordering her to kneel. He and Sean O'Brien began choking Jennifer with Sean's red shoelaces. But they tore apart, and they had to finish what they started with the girls' shoelaces. Elizabeth, who was forced to witness Jennifer's murder, pleaded with the boys to spare her, offering to give them her phone number so they could meet up and hang out if they let her go. She did and said everything she could to save her life. However, it didn't work, and Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt to escape. Unfortunately, she was intercepted. Peter Kent always boasted about his steel-toed boots. It was with those boots that he attacked the girl, breaking her ribs and knocking out several teeth. Then, Peter, Jose, and Efren strangled Elizabeth with shoelaces. At that moment, they noticed Jennifer was still alive, and they started stomping on the victims' bodies and necks to ensure their demise. It was a monstrous murder of the girls, who simply wanted to take a shortcut so their parents wouldn't scold them. Without a shred of remorse, the killers divided the spoils, the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Jennifer and Elizabeth. They even took the watch with Goofy, a Disney character that Jennifer liked. On the first ring was engraved the letter E, and Jose took the ring to give it to his girlfriend, Esther. After committing the crime, several boys went to Peter's place, where his brother Joe and his 16-year-old wife, Christina, were present. Christina noticed that they were covered in blood, disheveled, as if they had just been in a fight. They threw the bloodied items at her and ordered her to get rid of them. Christina asked what had happened, and Jose replied that they had just had some fun. Then they began relishing the details of what they had done, showing enthusiasm and boasting, without any sign of remorse. It disgusted Christina and Joe to hear this, but they pretended that everything was normal and silently listened. Christina herself had been a victim of violence in the past, and the actions of the gang deeply affected her. When the boys left, she told her husband that he should call the police anonymously. Joe was hesitant because it wasn't just about his brother but also about the other gang members who could seek revenge against him. However, Christina couldn't bear the thought of the girls lying in the park without their families having a proper chance to say goodbye to them. She convinced Joe to make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, ensuring that nobody would know it was him. The next day, Joe made the call in a hushed tone, informing the police where to find the bodies. Initially, the police didn't find anything, but after 4 days, a persistent officer eventually discovered the crime scene. Undoubtedly, Christina and Joe were very scared when the police traced the anonymous call, but they had made the right decision in doing so. On June 29, 1993, all 6 members of the gang were arrested. The red nail polish belt they used to try to strangle Jennifer was found in O'Brien's apartment. During the interrogations, the friendship between the boys came to an abrupt end. Each of them claimed to have been in the park, but others were the ones who killed the girls. The police pieced together the full picture of how events unfolded that night. Nearly all the details about what happened were known thanks to the testimony of 14-year-old Venanzio Medellin. The boys were tried separately, so the families had to listen to the horrifying details of their daughter's murders 5 times. Venanzio Medellin was the exception. He made a deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The other 5 were sentenced to the death penalty. In the cases of Jose Medellin, Derek O'Brien, and Peter Cantu, the sentences were carried out. Sean O'Brien and Jose Medellin found the courage to apologize to the victims' families, but Peter Cantu didn't even do that. Adolfo and Melissa Pena believe it doesn't matter, as he wouldn't say anything that would change anything. The sentences of Efren and Raul were changed to life imprisonment because they were 17 at the time of the crime, and the Supreme Court prohibited the execution of individuals who were younger than 18 when they committed the crime. The court proceedings were extremely difficult, not only because the victims' families had to listen to their daughter's torture 5 times, but also because the criminals' relatives accused Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents of allowing them to go to the park, even though their own relatives were drinking and fighting there too. Efren's stepfather approached Elizabeth's father and said in Spanish, "This is your fault for not raising your daughter properly." The most horrifying aspect of this story is that it wasn't the gang's first crime. Sean O'Brien, Peter Cantu, and Jose Medellin had already murdered a young mother, 27-year-old Patricia Lopez. She was waiting at a gas station for her husband to pick her up after her car broke down. The killers dragged her into the park, where they assaulted and strangled her with Sean O'Brien's red nail polish belt. O'Brien's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and all of this happened 6 months before Jennifer and Elizabeth's murder. However, he was not charged for it. In addition to that, the criminals attacked random pedestrians on the street at least twice, including an armed robbery of another teenager and the murder of a completely unknown man. Despite the horror of the case, it had some positive consequences. Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents showed the world what it means to be a victim but not a helpless one. When the judge asked the parents if they wanted to address Peter Cantu, Randy Ertman immediately stood up and expressed everything he needed to say to Peter. Many criticized the judge for allowing Randy to yell at Peter. However, thanks to this, now after the sentencing, the victims' families have the right to address the perpetrator. They can also be present during the execution, which was previously prohibited. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer visited the executions of the 3 killers. The families continue to fight for justice to this day. All 6 convicts appealed their sentences. Venanzio was denied parole 5 times, and each time the families met with the judges to prevent his release. Randy said, "I want this man to sit in jail for the rest of his life. I want this piece of crap to die in jail, and I will do everything in my power to keep him in jail. Do you want him as your neighbor? Do you want him living next to you?" Jennifer and Elizabeth had no choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Unfortunately, after his daughter's murder, Randy tried to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. But after 5 years, he pulled himself together, quit drinking, and started the path of healing. He and his wife moved away because everything in their hometown reminded them of their daughter. In 2014, at the age of 61, Randy Ertman passed away from lung cancer. Jennifer was his only daughter, and he fought not only for her but for the other victims as well. Thanks to him, Other victims' families now have more rights and opportunities.